all because of one lie. A girl once fell on the road where she slew the demon god, but now she'd woken up reincarnated as her own brother's great-great-granddaughter. The truth, only understood 80 years later, set Sil's heart ablaze with fury. Sil Laxia was the Empire's acknowledged prodigy. She stood at the peak of sword mastery before she even turned 17. By 20, her unmatched gift for magic had made her master of the Mage Tower. She was the undeniable pride of House Laxia, and until it all fell apart, she had never once hesitated. Her name echoed across the continent. Laxia became the Empire's most illustrious family. The power of both the Empire and the Mage Tower rested in her hands. When Sil drew the holy sword said to bear a divine miracle, her life reached its very peak. The Emperor seized the moment and gave the order, naming Sil commander of the army to carry out the final mission of sealing the demon god. This should have been the battle that cemented her place once and for all. But her brother Leon tried to talk her out of it. The mission to seal the demon god was fraught with danger. Rather than risk her life again, Leon simply wished his sister would find someone to fall in love with. The trouble was, her ideal type didn't seem to exist anywhere. He had to be considerate and funny and skilled in both swordsmanship and magic. And as for status, nothing less than a duke would do. Leon's face darkened and darkened again. No matter what, all he wanted was for his sister to live a happy life. He begged her to give up this dangerous mission. To the world, Leon carried himself with an almost merciless strictness. But in truth, the tenderness in his heart was reserved for family alone. He was one of the very few who truly cherished Silly. People's expectations were like two sides of a coin. The moment respect crumbled, it turned into endless condemnation. Sil pushed the door open. She lifted the infant from the cradle and rocked her gently. Her brother Leon's child had been born. For the sake of her family's future, Sil resolved to build them a world free of danger. She would seal the demon god once and for all. But sadly, the ferocity of the battle far exceeded anything she had imagined. The demon god's condensed power scorched her skin like the flames of hell itself. Her disciple Fram's anguished cries echoed in her ears. Yet in that moment, Sil only gazed calmly at the Empire behind her. Looking out over the vast battlefield, she seemed to glimpse her family's future prosperity. The next instant, at only 21, Sil offered her own body as the blade and fulfilled her vow to the Empire. But the promise she'd made to her brother that she would return home safely was buried forever within the legend she had written. In the instant her memory froze, Sil opened her eyes to find herself surrounded by unfamiliar faces. For a moment, she had no idea what was happening. Hadn't she already perished together with the demon god? Just then, the runes carved into the ground beneath her feet immediately caught Sil's attention. Even though the shape of the magic circle looked slightly different, it was without a doubt a soul-gathering spell. Could this be the work of the dark cult? As she pondered this, a furious shout rang out behind her. A face strikingly similar to her brother Leon's appeared before her. Muttering under his breath, he seemed upset that Sil had suddenly vanished. Sil looked up, dazed, and only after a moment did it dawn on her. He looked very much like her brother, but he clearly wasn't Leon himself. Seeing Sil sitting there in a stupor, the boy let out a sigh. He scooped her up, scolding her for being disrespectful in front of their great-grandmother's grave and telling her not to run away from home again. The sheer flood of information left Sil slowly forming a question mark in her mind. The boy set her on the donkey's back, then turned to look back at the gravestone. "Forgive the intrusion, great-grandmother. We'll come visit you again with my brother next time." Just then, a maid arrived at the graveyard carrying a lantern. Seeing that the young master and young lady were both unharmed, she finally let out a deep sigh of relief. Sil stared intently at the boy who looked so much like her brother, the silver hair unique to House Laxia. A moment later, Sil tested the waters and called out a name. "Redis Laxia." The boy, hearing his full name, immediately scolded Sil. "Just call me brother from now on." And with that, an answer finally settled in Sil's heart. The name carved into the gravestone she'd just seen was her own. Hard as it was to accept, Sil came to terms with the fact that she'd been reincarnated into a descendant's body. It was a tradition in House Laxia to name their children after their ancestors. This business of naming a child after a deceased forebear seemed to carry some kind of symbolic weight. Just as she was about to ask what year it was, a crow's cry sounded overhead, and Sil instinctively hunched her shoulders. Seeing this, Rydas teased her for looking so much like a frightened little girl. In her past life, the grounds of the estate had been paved with glittering magic stones. But now everything around her was dim and dull. Back then, she'd gone through no end of trouble buying up those expensive stones just so the children and young women could walk the grounds safely at night. Now there wasn't a trace of magic stone left anywhere. Reedes fell silent for a moment upon hearing this. Those stones were probably sold off before the two of them were even born. Reedes took his sister's hand. "No matter what," he said. "Let's go home and eat first." Syl's head drooped. She decided she'd figure out what was going on later. But the moment they reached the front door, Syl's memories were shaken all over again. The once magnificent castle now stood in complete ruin. Unlike Ritus's excitement, Syl was too stunned to speak. She stared at the portraits of her ancestors on the wall. Why had the family fallen into such disrepair? The very glory she had built with her own hands back in the day seemed to have vanished completely with the passing years. Perhaps it was simply too much information to take in at once. Syl collapsed straight to the ground. Hearing the commotion, her eldest brother came rushing over and hurriedly asked Ritus what had happened. But Ritus was just as baffled. Why would she just pass out the moment she got home? Just then, Syl's stomach let out a loud growl. Her brothers burst out laughing. "Looks like we'd better hurry up and get dinner ready." Still, this strange behavior from their sister left Ritus with a faint frown. New era, year 515. It took Syl a long while to accept this new reality. The family, 80 years after her death, rock-hard bread and soup so thin it could no longer be watered down. Even the apricot jam, which barely passed as edible, was nearly gone. Syl looked between the two of them. Rides, who so resembled her brother Leon, and the older brother, apparently named Michael. To survive, the two had sold off nearly everything the family owned. This whole situation looked like it was on the verge of collapse. Just then, Ritus, ignoring Michael's attempt to stop him, spoke up anyway, mentioning that Syl badly wanted to enter the sword tournament. But the family desperately needed that prize money to pay off its debts. Michael's side income alone was nowhere near enough. Hearing this, Syl's jaw dropped in shock all over again. There was actually a 1,000,000 coin debt on top of everything else. Michael spoke softly to comfort his sister. "This time, let our second brother Ritus enter the sword tournament instead." Their eldest brother simply couldn't afford the steep entry fee for a second competitor. Syl had no idea how to respond. She got up and headed back to her room. Inside the castle at night, Syl crept up the creaking staircase and let out an eerie laugh. Anyone, please tell me. What on earth happened over these 80 years? The maids who witnessed this were terrified, afraid something had gone wrong with their young lady's mind. Syl flopped face first onto her bed, thinking over her own bizarre reincarnation and the hard life Ritus and Michael had been living. Utterly clueless, all Syl could do was vent her frustration at the mattress. Even 10 years could bring changes no one could predict, let alone 80, in which every friend she'd once had was now long gone. Her brother Leon, too, had passed away ages ago. The promise she'd made to return home safely to him had arrived in the end 80 years too late. Back then, her brother and the nephew still swaddled in his arms had always been proud of her. And this time, she wouldn't abandon her family either. But why, of all things, had she woken up inside a black magic circle this time? This magic, born of the dark cult, was something Syl knew all too well. She had spent her whole life fighting against it. Unable to find an answer, Syl could only curse her brother Leon for being an idiot. Meanwhile, Rides made his way to the study. He saw Michael still hard at work and frowned. "It's getting late, don't push yourself too hard. Rides, why don't you take Syl to the capital?" Rides, who understood the family's situation all too well, looked at Michael in disbelief. But his eldest brother simply said calmly that he could just take on a bit more work himself. He didn't want to disappoint Syl, who had already run away from home once over this. Like a squirrel whose only food had just been stolen away. So just let her go. You know how things stand at home. If we wait any longer, Syl may never get the chance to see the outside world at all. House Laxia, in its glory days, had once been the wealthiest of the Empire's 5 duchies. With countless mines to its name, it drew in many of the finest jewelers and weaponsmiths, all eager to join its ranks. The abundant tax revenue from its territory kept the family thriving beyond compare. But all of that was completely overturned the moment the previous duchess died. Michael and Ritus understood this all too well. The family was on the very brink of ruin. If things kept going this way, their sister Syl might even lose her right to take part in society. As the family's legitimate heirs, the two of them were powerless to stop it. Thinking of all this, Ritus grew visibly furious. They simply lived on like this, without a shred of a duke's family's power. Hearing this, Michael could only comfort him. Just wait one more year. Once he came of age, Aunt Sorvel would return the ring to him. Until then, Regis was determined to do everything he could. Hearing this, Regis gradually calmed down. Their eldest brother Michael had done everything in his power to look after the two of them. He still remembered standing at their parents' funeral, with Sil collapsed weakly in his arms, while all he could do was watch helplessly, as Michael had his authority stripped away by a side branch of the family. In that moment, he had felt a desperate urge to grow up as fast as he could, if only so he could take some of the burden off Michael's shoulders. Early the next morning, Sil woke up looking utterly weary. The events of the previous night had left her unable to sleep. Outside the window, the once towering spire had now completely collapsed. Though her title as a duchess still remained, with the family on the edge of bankruptcy, it seemed to count for nothing. The thought made Sil suddenly bolt upright. Right now, her top priority was finding whoever was responsible for all of this. A while later, Sil finally strolled down, fashionably late, to have breakfast. Michael wore a smile on his face. Radies, as always, looked helplessly exasperated with his sister who loved to sleep in. But looking at the same old rock-hard bread, Sil found she had absolutely no appetite. Yet seeing how used to it her two brothers were, she still picked up her knife and fork. Normally, even if a family ran into financial trouble, it wouldn't end up losing everything like this. Sil thought to herself, scheming. Could it be that idiot Leon had made some failed investment? Or perhaps a thought suddenly crossed Sil's mind. They'd fallen victim to a property scam. The thought made Sil slam her hand on the table in anger, only to be met with her brother's looks as if she'd lost her mind. Seeing their sister grow even more furious, Michael and Radius were completely baffled. A moment later, Sil finally turned to her brother Michael and asked if she could borrow some of his time after breakfast. Outside the estate, everything looked worn down, and yet it still felt strangely familiar to Sil. Sil gazed blankly at her surroundings. Michael still had no idea what his sister was up to. The two of them decided to talk as they walked. But the once elegant garden path she remembered was now completely overrun with weeds. Unwilling to accept this, Sil pointed toward a patch of empty ground. Where had that enormous golden fountain gone? It had taken 3 years to build, a treasure fit for royalty, meant to symbolize House Laxia itself. The once magnificent fountain had vanished without a trace. It had been sold off to Duke Oblong. Sil's whole body went rigid. House Oblong had once been House Laxia's fiercest rival. Years ago, in the race to mine precious gems, House Laxia had gone head-to-head with House Oblong, who dealt in marble. The two families had competed fiercely for the few master craftsmen available. As reluctant as she was to accept it, Sil quickly talked herself into feeling better about it. Well, better to sell off a fountain than to sell off a descendant, she supposed. Sil pointed toward another spot. Where had the Mage Tower gone? A wistful look crossed her face. The Mage Tower had once been the highest hall of magical knowledge in the land, but sadly the tower, along with all the land surrounding it, had been sold off as well. Hearing this, Sil's expression darkened, then darkened again. Because a magic tower's field of influence stretched so wide, it meant the land around it was enormous, and yet all of that had been sold off too. Seeing his sister's strange expression, Michael assumed she was troubled by how run down the family had become. Even though he was a duke on the verge of bankruptcy, he still didn't want his sister to know the full truth of anything. He was doing everything he could to let Sil grow up in a warm, loving environment. Michael said gently. The origin of Sil's name came from the great-grandmother who had fallen in the war against the demon god, so from the moment she was born, she carried the weight of her family's hopes. But it was in this very moment that Sil learned something shocking. In order to give her a proper burial, Leon, who was Michael's great-grandfather, had spared no expense, spending the value of 10 mines. Back when the war to seal the demon god had taken place on the territory of House Rankit, the army had suffered near total casualties in that battle. And after Sil perished together with the demon god, her body could never be found anywhere across that vast, ravaged wasteland. For this reason, Leon had spared no expense, using every last bit of the family's wealth just to find her. Hearing this, Sil couldn't help but scoff. It wasn't as if her corpse was worth going to such extreme lengths for, but Michael simply crouched down to look at his sister. He'd had that same thought once as a child. But now, he said, he'd make the exact same decision his great-grandfather had made. No matter the cost, a family member should never be left to be buried in a foreign land. As for what remained of the family's fortune, aside from the iron ore, everything else had been destroyed or auctioned off amid business disputes. Michael gently cupped his sister's cheeks, trying to comfort her. But deep down, Sil understood clearly. This wasn't Michael's fault, nor was it anyone else's. Yet seeing Michael, who at just 16 had been forced to shoulder the responsibility of caring for his siblings, Sil felt a faint aching pain in her chest. That night, Sil leaned by the window, unable to calm her thoughts. Even though Michael had spoken of it so lightly, she could still imagine what it must have been like when Leon made that decision. The ugly faces of the rest of the family rising up in protest. They had even gone so far as to divide up the wealth that belonged to her brother Leon. Thinking of all this, Sil finally had a rare dream about her brother. He still looked exactly the way he had back then. It was a time when the conflict between brother and sister had reached its peak. Back then, Sil trained with her sword tirelessly, day after day, which drove her brother Leon to absolute fury. He ignored his sister's pleading and wrenched the wooden sword straight out of Sil's hands, hoping that by doing so, he could shatter Sil's unrealistic fantasies. No matter how hard you try, they're never coming back. Sil's mother had been a remarkable mage who grew up among a nomadic tribe, while her father was a rigid, proud second son of a duke. The two had come from entirely different worlds, and yet they'd fallen in love quickly and married. But gradually, her mother grew unable to adjust to life in the city. Wanting to return to her tribe, she found herself locked in an irreconcilable conflict with her husband. The moment their love began to cool, her father's meticulous devotion twisted into something closer to obsession, and it drove her mother away for good. But the moment her mother left, her father, nearly out of his mind, went searching for her across the plains, leaving the grand estate entirely to Sil. Because of this, Sil pushed herself relentlessly, determined to become a beautiful, strong young lady, hoping to bring the parents who had abandoned him back to the family. But her efforts only made her brother even angrier. Leon stubbornly believed that Sil shouldn't have to lose her entire childhood because of their parents' mistakes, blowing a big snot bubble as she laughed, or bursting into tears over stepping in dog droppings. He didn't want his sister's whole life to be dictated by these troubles. From that day on, Leon made a habit of bringing Sil a gift almost every week during the holidays, and every time they met, he always did a good job hiding his exhaustion, his face dazzlingly bright. But the good days didn't last. Soon after, her mother died in a car accident while her father was chasing after her. And not long after that, her father, now the subject of scandalous headlines, passed away too. In that moment, little Sil seemed to become completely alone in the world. It was at the funeral that Leon's parents, who were Sil's father's older brother and his wife, formally offered to adopt her. Not long after, the move to her new home came rather abruptly, but thankfully the little toys she'd collected since childhood had all survived the move. Sil's fragile childhood grew resilient and beautiful thanks to Leon. Those memories still warmed Sil's heart. But sadly, in the end, she never got to keep her promise to her brother. Looking at the photograph on the wall, she still looked just as young as ever. But Leon, now the 13th generation Duke, had grown noticeably older. Sil slowly reached out her hand and brushed her fingers over her brother's portrait frame. The furrow in Leon's brow hadn't eased until the day he died. Sil seemed to understand at last why she'd been brought back here. Even if she rebuilt the family, the time that had been lost could never return. Her own childhood had only turned out beautiful because Leon had protected her. And now these two children before her seemed to be the ones who needed her protection instead. Sil wanted to tell her brother not to worry. She would surely restore the family's former glory. Like a rainbow after the storm, Sil believed she could do it. After finishing breakfast, Michael and Ritus agreed to Sil's request to go to the capital. Seeing Sil start to worry about the family's finances, Ritus's face fell at once. "This isn't something you need to worry about," he said. "That's what Michael and I are here for." Still, thinking it over, Sil did feel a certain longing for the capital. 80 years had passed, and who knew what it looked like now? Sil quickly wiped her mouth and was about to head out to the garden to clear her mind, when a group of attendants swarmed around her, ready with a sun hat and a brooch. Their blatant favoritism only strengthened Sil's resolve. A peaceful stillness settled over the estate. Sil sat beneath a tree, intending to think carefully about her own future and the family's. Just then, a flicker of magical light suddenly shone from Sil's chest. The once-in-a-generation prodigy was displaying her astonishing affinity for magic once again. Faced with the family's current crisis, Sil decided it was time to give the world another small shock. A little while earlier, Sil had been sitting beneath the tree, thinking over her family's future, when the abrupt glow of magic from her chest sent her into a complete panic. Magical power was the essential condition for casting any spell, And while magical power itself could be built up through later training, the speed of that training depended on one's innate affinity for magic. As that affinity grew stronger, magical power would attach to the body all the more seamlessly. And even though she'd been the greatest prodigy of her past life, Sil found herself stunned at just how astonishing this body's affinity for magic truly was. Sil cautiously tested the waters. The next moment, this body, which had never trained a single day, easily produced a surge of magical power. Even her past self had never possessed a talent quite like this. With this sudden shift, Sil finally found the answer to the question of her family's future that she'd been agonizing over. She was certain that with her own magical skill, she could easily reclaim her place as master of the Mage Tower and provide for Michael and Ritus, all while reaching the very peak of life. But right now, a new problem had emerged. Early training in magic was extremely important, and it required a large amount of practice materials, which meant funding was absolutely essential. Sil picked up a stick and started sketching out a plan on the ground. The most urgent matter was still figuring out exactly how much of the family's fortune remained. Two voices argued loudly inside her head. The angelic Sil loudly declared that she was a magical prodigy, the likes of which the world had never seen, while the devilish Sil bluntly pointed out reality. The family currently had no spare funds for her to even practice magic with, and so Sil's little mental theater officially began. She imagined herself loudly announcing to Michael and Ritus that she was their great-grandmother, reincarnated. "Give me the family's funds to use for now, and I'll be sure to pay you back generously later." But obviously a line like that would only convince Michael and Ritus that their sister badly needed to see a doctor about her head. Clearly that approach wasn't going to work. The second option was to start a business, but Sil had never run one in her life. In truth, plenty of declining hereditary nobles chose to go into business, but most of them ended in failure. Besides, starting a business required startup capital too. Sil quickly thought of another plan. Surely there'd be no harm in becoming a private tutor? As someone who had once been a legendary master of both swordsmanship and magic 80 years ago, Sil had trained 2 disciples in her past life. The only problem was that she was now just 12 years old. After a moment's thought, the clever Sil quickly came up with an idea. She could simply market herself using her natural affinity for magic and the Laxia name. Looking over her freshly hatched plan, Sil felt full of confidence. The 12-year-old Grand Duchess's fledgling business venture, light as a breeze through the mountains, was about to give the world another little shock. Meanwhile, in the capital, after a long search, the guards had finally found him. A boy sitting quietly beneath a tree. Kiskiramov? The boy had vanished suddenly during archery practice. The anxious guards, having searched everywhere, were just about to speak, when they suddenly noticed a trace of blood on the boy's fingertip. To their surprise, the boy simply explained that he'd pulled the bowstring too tight. But no matter how they looked at it, the guards couldn't bring themselves to believe that excuse. They assumed it had to be the House Robald tutor deliberately tormenting the boy, and declared this matter would absolutely be reported to His Majesty the Emperor. To treat His Majesty's only grandson this way? But before they could finish speaking, they were suddenly cut off. Kiska isn't an only child, is he? Doesn't he have a twin brother, Kassadin? A woman's icy voice reached the ears of all three, showing not the slightest restraint despite Kiska's status. She demanded to know why he was here instead of in class. Hearing this, the boy quickly hid his blood-stained finger and claimed he was resting here because he couldn't keep up with the lesson. The guard's gaze slowly turned cold, but the woman paid it no mind whatsoever, her tone dripping with undisguised contempt. This was finally more than the guard beside him could bear, but before he could say anything, he found himself scolded by her attendant instead, for daring to be so disrespectful toward the crown princess. Faced with this situation, he seemed at a complete loss, all because his twin brother had been named crown prince, leaving the entire empire. With only this one guard standing beside him, his fingertips still throbbing faintly with pain. But the mockery and prejudice within the palace still sent Kiska turning back toward his lesson. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Sil's strange behavior had also caught Ritus's attention. She simply sat on a small rock nearby, watching Ritus practice his swordsmanship, until, unnerved by her staring, Ritus finally felt a chill run down his spine, and asked what exactly was going on with her. His sister would normally still be fast asleep at this hour, but now Sil just kept staring intently at him. After a moment, Sil finally asked her brother about the sword tournament. The sword tournament was the highest stage of swordsmanship in the Empire, and Ritus hoped that winning it would earn him a spot in the royal guard. He added rather smugly that it was all for the family's honor. Having heard enough, Sil excused herself and left, saying she still had other materials to look into, leaving Radis standing there alone, utterly bewildered. His sister really was acting strange today. A while later, Michael, looking at Sil, felt the exact same way. The textbook he was writing needed some annotations added. Sil only had to search briefly before she had all the books he needed laid out on the table. Michael stared at the books in his hands, utterly disbelieving. Sil could pinpoint exactly what he needed every single time, as if she knew every single volume on the shelves by heart. Sil tilted her head, looking at the stunned Michael. "What's wrong? Do you need something else?" Sil turned to glance around the study again, and inwardly, she grew more and more speechless. Every valuable book in the entire library had already been sold off. Looks like she'd have to get pocket money from the children, just like a nephew asking an uncle. Fortunately, at least two things about the children brought her some comfort. Reedy's, training relentlessly with his sword, truly had the potential to win the tournament, while Michael's outstanding writing talent clearly meant he'd taken well to his tutor's teaching. Any family that produced two heirs like this would have every reason to be proud. After thinking it over, Sil decided to speak up. Does the family have no other assets left at all? Her brother Leon had been a strict, meticulous man. Back when Sil first entered high society, he'd even scheduled her entire day down to the half hour. A brother like that, after selling off the mines, surely would have kept something in reserve. Sure enough, Michael's answer confirmed her suspicion, but just as Sil's smile was halfway formed, she learned that the assets were now in someone else's hands. The young Sil of the past had long faded from Robin's memory. The 12-year-old Sil, the 2-year-old Sil, was determined to make the villain who had betrayed the family pay a heavy price. Not long before, Sil had finally gotten her answer from Michael. The House Laxia signet ring was a symbol of power that only the Duke himself was allowed to wear. Any document stamped with the head of household's ring carried the full authority of the Duke, guaranteed by the royal family itself. Especially when it came to managing the ducal family's funds, just thinking about it was enough to make Sil want to break down. She'd once thought that no matter how far a great ducal house fell, it would never end up looking quite like this. It wasn't until just now that Michael finally told her the truth. The ring was currently in Aunt Sorvel's possession, though she claimed she would return it once Michael came of age. Sil found she simply couldn't bring herself to believe that. Just then, the maid Robin arrived with tea for her young lady. Seeing the troubled look on Sil's face, "Is something bothering you?" After a moment's thought, Sil decided to ask Robin what she thought of their guardian, Aunt Sorvel. This was the first time Sil had ever asked about her. The whole story went back 5 years. Back then, the Duke and Duchess of Laxia had passed away from illness, and it was around that time that Countess Sorvel appeared, claiming to be the children's legal guardian. On the surface, being a ducal family's guardian seemed like a position of great power, but in reality, it came with many restrictions. Royal-appointed observers kept track of their every move, which was why the rest of the nobility kept a respectful distance from the position. Though only a distant relative, Sorvel had volunteered herself for the role, leaving Michael with no choice but to accept her. Because the Duke and Duchess's deaths had come so suddenly, no guardian had ever been formally designated. And without one, the young Sil and Reedus, back then, could very well have been sent off to be raised by some other ducal family, which meant Michael had no other option at the time. He'd only been 11 years old 5 years ago. But to keep his younger siblings from being separated, Michael had only one choice available to him. Robin then admitted she'd never had much fondness for Lady Sorvel. Just last year, the dismissal of the household staff and caretakers had been Sorvel's doing entirely. Hearing this, it finally clicked for Sil that the family's finances had been entirely in Sorvel's hands this whole time. A moment later, Sil stared in disbelief at the bill in her hands. This small amount of money could hardly support 4 people's lives, let alone reflect any dignity befitting House Laxia. The estate's maintenance budget was pitifully small. They even owed money to the butcher and the fruit stand. Even Robin's wages as a maid had gone unpaid for a month. Apart from the little Michael earned on the side, everything else came entirely from Sorvel. Just then, Robin also brought over the family's account books from recent years. But Sil quickly sensed something was off. The ownership of the iron ore mines clearly still belonged to the family. This was the very material used to forge weapons, which was exactly why the founding emperor, wary of those weapons ever being used for rebellion, had personally entrusted management of the iron ore to House Laxia. But in the accounts Sorvel had provided, this entire source of income had been completely concealed. It could now be confirmed that Sorvel had been embezzling the family's assets. And this was the very evidence of how she'd been deceiving the children. Thinking this over, Sil made up her mind at once. She had to strip Sorvel of her guardianship as soon as possible. Faced with her young mistress's bold idea, Robin was momentarily stunned. But Sil wasn't about to let that stop her. She needed to find a new guardian, and fast. Even if Sorvel refused to sit back and watch, there was no way she'd let it stop her. That heir who dared to strip the children of their rightful power. Sil decided she wouldn't let this woman get away with it any longer. Robin, for her part, said she was willing to help. After all, Sorvel had long looked down on her, a loyal maid, with contempt anyway. But the account books alone weren't quite strong enough as evidence. Sil still needed something with far more weight behind it. A moment later, something in the newspaper caught Sil's eye. Duke Oblong's young granddaughter collapses. A month earlier, the young granddaughter had collapsed during her birthday celebration. Witnesses claimed her skin had begun turning black even as she fell. Sil froze for a moment, then turned to ask Robin whether anyone had reached out to the Mage Tower about it, only to suddenly remember the once towering Mage Tower no longer existed at all. As its former master, though Sil didn't want to exploit someone else's misfortune for her own gain, there simply seemed to be no better option available right now. She would have to write a letter to Duke Oblong. Sil had finally found a way to solve the guardianship problem. Watching her young mistress's retreating figure, Robin found herself a little dazed. Sil really had changed so much. Robin had joined House Laxia 10 years earlier. Back then, she'd still been a little girl wandering the streets. Suffering from long-term malnutrition, she'd been taken in by the Duke and Duchess at the time, and it was from that point on that she began serving the ducal household. After the Duke and Duchess passed away, Robin resolved to protect the three siblings and the family with everything she had. But Sorvel had very nearly ruined it all. The moment she seized full control of the family's power, she issued dismissal notices to every single servant, accompanied by harsh threats. Either take the money and leave, or she'd strip them of their clothes and throw them out of the household herself. Robin should have left along with everyone else during that purge, but in the end, she chose to stay. Not out of guilt or pity, but out of a sense of responsibility that came with being an adult. When little Sil and Radis had looked up at her so carefully, watching them hold back their tears, until Sil and Radis finally couldn't hold them in any longer. "Please don't go, will you?" Just as the helpless young Robin once had. When she'd faced the kind Duke and Duchess all those years ago, Robin knelt down gently and wiped the tears from the corners of Sil's eyes. She'd only been 20 years old back then. Young as she was, she'd still given the three of them all the security they needed, faced with the bustling crowd of servants leaving, and the well-meaning advice from everyone around her. Robin still chose to stay, taking on this burden of protection all on her own. Sil's unyielding resolve had completely changed the look on Sorvel's face. She never could have imagined that the daughter of a fallen ducal house would strip her of every last shred of her dignity. Not long before, Sil had finally found a way to have the guardian replaced. A week after sending out the letter, Robin came rushing to find Sil. They'd finally received a reply from House Oblong. Sil took the letter. A smile curved at the corners of her mouth. Things were unfolding exactly as she'd expected. The news that Duke Oblong's granddaughter, Lady Ilya, had awoken had already spread across the entire empire. Robin could hardly believe it. Thinking that she wasn't yet ready to reveal she could use magic, Sil decided, after some thought, to keep it a secret for now. And yet, up until now, Countess Sorvel still hadn't sent any reply. While reaching out to Duke Oblong, Sil had also contacted Sorvel at the same time. The letter's contents were nothing out of the ordinary. It simply demanded that she rehire the family's servants and provide a clear explanation for the missing iron ore revenue, as well as immediately return the head of household signet ring. Yet when it came to the iron ore revenue, Michael had no idea about any of it. Clearly, heir training had been abandoned entirely, all to cut costs. This left Sil deeply troubled, since Michael would reach the age to succeed as head of house next year. If he couldn't even spot such an obviously terrible set of accounts, he was bound to become a laughingstock the moment he took the ducal seat, and House Laxia's reputation would plummet along with him. Thinking of this, Sil resolved that even if it meant taking the blame herself, she had to drive Sorvel out for good. The most urgent task now was restoring the family's shattered system. Michael was the very core of rebuilding the family. With that thought, Sil's fury toward Sorvel became all the harder to contain. By contrast, Robin, who had suffered just as much, seemed remarkably calm about it all. In her heart, this burden that seemed so heavy had long since melted away in the warm moments she'd shared with the three Laxia siblings. Hearing this, Sil found herself thinking about what it truly meant to grow up. Unlike the legal definition of coming of age, real maturity meant having a heart that had truly grown up. Even as Robin took on the responsibility of caring for them, Sil had come to genuinely think of her as a family elder. Compared to her, Sorvel, the guardian in name only, was like the flip side of the same coin. To keep Robin from wearing herself out, Sil had already sent letters to the family's former servants, and they, in turn, had promised to answer the ducal house's call the moment they were needed. Even though the road ahead was full of hardship, Sil pressed forward without wavering. Just then, Robin's expression suddenly froze. Sorvel's carriage had just pulled up right in front of them. The very moment she laid eyes on the two of them, Sorvel maintained her usual air of overbearing arrogance. Without so much as a word, she swung the umbrella in her hand straight at Robin, venting the fury that had been building since the moment she'd received the letter. Declaring outright that Robin was an ill-bred creature, how dare a mere servant stir up trouble in front of the children? But what she hadn't expected was that the children of House Laxia, always so meek before, would now stand right in front of her and defy her will. What exactly do you think you're doing, coming at me like this? But Sil's icy words didn't seem to faze her at all. Sorvel leaned down to look at Sil, not for a moment believing that a 12-year-old girl could be capable of such calculated tactics. As for the letter accusing her of concealing the iron ore revenue, she instinctively assumed it had to be the maid Robin's doing behind the scenes, and the commanding tone demanding she return the signet ring was even more than Sorvel could stand. Sil went head-to-head with Sorvel without backing down, demanding she respond to every single point laid out in the letter. Hearing this, Sorvel was practically laughing out of sheer rage. She declared that the only reason the three Laxia siblings could scrape by at all was thanks to her own hard work as their aunt. How dare she raise her voice at her now? But Sil was no longer the timid, spineless girl Sorvel remembered. That letter had been written word for word by her own hand. And right now, all she wanted was for Sorvel to shut her mouth and answer the question herself. It was clear Sorvel simply didn't believe the letter had come from Sil at all. In her eyes, a 12-year-old girl couldn't possibly be capable of something like that. So instead, she unleashed her fury on Robin, the maid, entirely. It was the perfect chance to intimidate this girl she saw as hopelessly naive to the ways of the world. But Sil's transformation caught her completely off guard. Her cheap provocation failed to shake Sil's composure in the slightest. Sil calmly and methodically laid out every one of Sorvel's misdeeds, and even called her a shameless creature. The sharp words pushed Sorvel to completely abandon any pretense of a countess's dignity. Her fingertips raked across Sil's cheek. She stared at Sil in disbelief, daring her to say that again. Her mouth full of accusations against Michael. How dare he let his sister defy her authority like this? Witnessing Sorvel's behavior with her own eyes only made Sil more certain, declaring outright that the woman had no business being anyone's guardian. Hearing this, Sorvel raised her hand, ready to teach Sil a harsh lesson. But midair, her wrist was suddenly caught by someone. Rita spoke calmly. "What exactly do you think you're doing to my sister?" Seeing him arrive, Sorvel's fury only flared higher. She pointed at Sil and began recounting her supposed insolence. But Rita simply replied, "So what? Does being angry give you the right to lay a hand on Sil?" The remark left Sorvel utterly stunned. And just then, Michael finally appeared before them all. The moment he saw the mark on his sister's face, faced with Sorvel's accusations, his first instinct was to apologize on reflex. But it was in that moment that Sil stepped forward. Michael had done nothing wrong. Looking at his sister, Michael was momentarily stunned, then quickly instructed Robin to take the two of them to have their wounds treated. It wasn't that he'd never considered fighting back. It was only for the sake of his younger siblings' safety that he'd chosen to apologize to Sorvel on his sister's behalf. Seeing this, Rita said nothing more, only rubbing the back of his neck in obvious discomfort. Robin, meanwhile, prepared to take Sil to have the wound on her face, looked at first. Just as they passed each other, Sil fixed her eyes on Sorvel, telling her she would be petitioning the Empire to formally review the guardianship matter. She told the Countess to remember that well. Then, paying no mind to Sorvel's murderous glare, she turned and left the woman with nothing but her retreating back. She wasn't nearly as reckless as the Countess. Little did anyone expect that Sorvel's sudden approach concealed a shocking scheme behind it. Not long before, Sil had formally made her stance clear. After leaving Sorvel with nothing but a cold, retreating figure, Reedes had already finished treating his sister's wound in no time. Even though it stung a little, Sil simply waved it off. This was evidence of Sorvel's violence. and she intended to preserve it carefully. The trial to strip the Countess of custody would begin the day after tomorrow. The news clearly caught Regis off guard. He looked over at his sister. She seemed the same as before, and yet somehow different. There was no doubt about it. The old Syl could never have done what she just did, standing toe-to-toe with Sorvel like an equal. But no matter what, a sister was still a sister. Regis gave Syl a firm flick on the forehead. Could you at least discuss it with your brother next time before doing something like this? As her brothers, they never wanted their sister to shoulder this kind of pressure all alone, just like a home-cooked dish. The warmth of family always showed itself in the smallest, most unexpected moments. Thinking of this, Syl had no choice but to apologize to a still scowling Regis. Regis fully supported Syl's decision to replace their guardian, and then asked his sister what her plan was. Just then, Michael walked in as well. Having just resolved the confrontation with Sorvel, he too wanted to have a talk with his sister. Hearing this, both siblings looked rather taken aback, then exchanged a somewhat tense glance. A moment later, Michael asked about his sister's injury. Upon learning that the wound had only been cleaned, he grew a little worried it might leave a scar. But Syl's reasoning was simple enough. She wanted to use the wound as evidence in Sorvel's trial in a few days. Hearing this, Michael hesitated, stammering for a long moment before finally speaking up. He asked his sister the real reason behind her request to change guardians. Was it because she thought the family was too poor? And that was why she hated living with her brothers. Hearing this, Syl felt completely thrown off. What on earth did that have to do with anything? Seeing how upset Michael looked, Syl quickly explained her decision. She had never once had a thought like that. Michael's reaction was something Syl never could have predicted. Instead of getting angry at his sister, he simply blamed himself over and over. He understood Syl's decision perfectly well. He was just afraid it would bring even more trouble down on his siblings. The scene from earlier was etched deep in his mind. Sorvel's biting words as she berated him. Do you even know how to calculate taxes? Do you know how many letters need to be sent to the royal household? In her eyes, Michael was nothing but a boy, barely more than a child, already scheming to seize the head of household seat. Before he could even finish, Sorvel struck at his sorest spot again. Or maybe, she said, you'd rather your younger siblings. He could only shoulder every mistake as his own, which was why he'd come to talk Syl out of it, given how difficult things already were, even though there were times he felt a single day could stretch on forever. As the eldest brother, all he could do was endure it silently. His siblings were still so young, so he clung to an unrealistic hope that if he just kept holding on, better days would eventually come. He had once been the ducal family's pride and joy, its eldest son, but now, all he could do was swallow the bitterness and hold up a small patch of sky for the three of them. The next moment, Syl pulled him into a tight embrace. Syl understood exactly what Sorvel would say, and she also knew how hard her brother had been holding on all this time. Children split up among different families rarely ended up happy. Some were even used as pawns in political marriages, dragged into dangerous family feuds. Michael had been working to prevent the worst from happening ever since he was 11 years old, which was why Syl believed her brother had already done more than enough. And right now she had a solid plan of her own. She would only tell Michael for the time being, keeping it a secret from Regis for now. A moment later, inside the meeting room, faced with the tea Robin had brought her, Sorvel merely gave it a cold, dismissive glance, declaring that Robin had 3 days to move out of the ducal residence, or else she'd have her whipped as punishment. Her words dripped with threat. But Syl told Robin not to bother. A new guardian would be arriving soon enough. The blatant provocation left Sorvel so furious she slammed her fist on the table, but Syl simply ignored her reaction completely, which only made Sorvel wary of the girl standing before her. Seeing this, Syl merely smiled and instructed Robin to bring her aunt a glass of ice water. It looked like she really needed to cool down and calm herself. Sorvel clenched her fists and threatened that she'd have Syl sent straight to a convent, a place filled not only with clergy but with countless criminals. Somewhere even movement itself was restricted, which was no different from being locked up. But such a cheap threat was almost enough to make Syl laugh out loud. Sounds like Aunt Sorvel is the one who should be going there instead. Before Sorvel could even respond, Reedy suddenly burst into the meeting room. He'd only meant to ask Robin to prepare some juice, but instead walked straight into this scene. Sensing there was nothing more to be gained here, Sorvel prepared to leave. But Syl spoke up, telling her to leave the ring behind. How exactly does a guardian justify carrying around someone else's head of household ring? But Sorvel remained crafty to the end. insisting that this matter would have to be settled with Michael directly. And with that, she stormed off in a huff. A moment later, back in her room, Sorval smashed a mirror in fury. She'd already wasted far too much time in this ducal house. If only she could find the radiant rainbow. She wouldn't care one bit about being handed off as anyone's guardian. Long ago, back when House Laxia was at the height of its glory, a duke who adored his younger sister dearly had a special necklace commissioned for the princess as she prepared to make her debut in high society. The necklace, called the Radiant Rainbow, was crafted from gemstones mined by the ducal family itself. Using the very finest stone they'd unearthed, painstakingly crafted into a masterpiece, every noblewoman who saw it fell hopelessly in love with it. But its rightful owner had never shown the slightest interest in it at all. And once the ducal family began its decline, the necklace vanished without a trace, never once resurfacing in all the decades since, which left Sorval utterly convinced it had to still be somewhere inside the ducal residence. She'd spent years searching for it, yet never once managed to find it. The only clue she'd gotten came from the servants she'd dismissed. It had to be somewhere within the ducal house, in a chamber that could only be opened using the head of household's signet ring. After a moment's thought, she decided she would drive all 3 siblings out of the house entirely for a month so she could search every inch of it herself. Little did she know, every word of this plan had already been overheard clearly by Syl, who was eavesdropping using magic. Though Syl was stunned by Sorval's true motive, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of regret over her plan, because that necklace had been made specifically for her by her own brother, even though she'd only worn it twice, which had made Leon furious at the time. Based on her brother Leon's personality, Syl instantly guessed exactly where the necklace was hidden. It had to be in the most secret place in the entire family estate. The Dewdrop Chamber, the secret vault built by the very first head of the family. According to Robin, the previous head of household had died so suddenly that there hadn't even been time to properly brief the new guardian, let alone reveal the secret of the Dewdrop Chamber. If that necklace really was still there, then solving every single one of the ducal family's problems wouldn't be a problem at all. The thought nearly made Syl burst out laughing. The silver-haired family was finally about to be reborn. The silver-haired family was finally about to be reborn. Sorval, now cornered and desperate, was completely thrown into panic the moment she learned the identity of the new guardian. Not long before, the trial to strip the guardian of her custody had officially begun. After Syl refused any attempt at mediation, the trial quickly moved on to its next stage. And the children of House Laxia had a remarkably simple demand: nothing more than stripping Sorval of her guardianship entirely. Syl laid out her accusations before the court, that during her time as guardian, Sorval had caused them irreparable harm. With that, she revealed the wound still visible on her face. The sight completely changed the look on Sorval's face. She never imagined that her one moment of carelessness would completely overturn the situation. The maid then submitted a medical report documenting Syl's injury. Sorval still tried to argue her case, but with the evidence stacked against her like an iron mountain, the judge dismissed her excuses outright. The documents clearly showed that over the past 5 years, Sorval had dismissed the household staff. Along with a long list of other failures as a guardian, she had never once arranged for Michael to receive any of the education befitting an heir. Sorval, however, had an excuse ready. She claimed the delay in his lessons was purely Michael's own fault. But before Michael could even respond, Syl was the first to expose the lie. The Countess's claim, she pointed out, had not a shred of evidence behind it. With that, Syl presented yet another complete set of evidence. Among the bills the Countess herself had paid, there wasn't a single expense that had gone toward education of any kind. A proper heir's education would normally include a full curriculum covering the territory and every other relevant field of knowledge. It was clear as day. Not only had he received no education at all, but his guardian had rarely even bothered to visit in person. Faced with the murmuring nobles in the gallery, Sorval began wailing loudly, insisting she'd been wronged, claiming that what was happening now was nothing more than a little playful teasing between her and the children, and she even tried to use the account books to prove her own innocence. In the materials Syl had submitted to the court, it clearly showed the major items Sorval had left out. The revenue from the iron ore hadn't been recorded anywhere in her books. Sorval tried once more to explain herself, claiming the accounts were so complicated that she'd recorded it in a separate ledger. Little did she know, this was exactly what Syl had been hoping for. The mention of 2 separate ledgers completely soured the presiding judge's opinion of her. Sorval realized her slip too late. But by then, it was already over. The judge had heard more than enough to reach his conclusion. He ordered her to submit the original ledger containing the iron ore revenue immediately, leaving Sorvel no room left to argue her way out. Hearing this, Sorvel completely lost her composure. She insisted she'd made only a minor mistake over the past 5 years, and that the children were still too young to do without her protection. At this, the judge turned to Michael with a meaningful look. As the eldest son of House Laxia, this was the moment he needed to make his position clear. Over the past 5 years, in the face of losing his parents and a guardian acting in bad faith, it was Michael who had carefully protected and raised his younger siblings, and he had no intention of backing down now either. Yes, he said, I have never once received an heir's education. Michael's voice rang out clearly for everyone to hear. Everything my sister Sil has said is true. The Countess even used the family's fractured state as an excuse to forcibly seize my head of household ring. I need to reclaim my rightful authority so that I can protect Ritas and Sil. As the future head of this house, I ask that the Countess be stripped of her guardianship. Without giving Sorvel any chance to speak, the judge immediately announced his verdict. Every charge of dereliction of duty against Sorvel was upheld, and so by the Empire's highest authority, her status as guardian was formally revoked, with a guarantee that this ruling would never be overturned. But the judge then went on to explain a pressing issue at hand. Without a guardian, the siblings would need to be taken in by another family. Hearing this, Sorvel immediately jumped in, hoping to convince the three of them to let her become their guardian once again. Little did she know Sil already had everything under control. The next moment, a dignified figure appeared at the entrance of the courtroom. The arrival of Duke Yuri Oblong sent a ripple of commotion through the room. He stood beside Sil, apologizing for arriving late after such a long journey. The judge, for his part, was completely taken by surprise. The very first head of House Oblong had been the Emperor's own brother. Among the Empire's 5 great ducal houses, only House Oblong could claim the noblest bloodline of all. Having him serve as the children's guardian completely changed the expression on Sorvel's face, who had been hoping to stir up trouble. Duke Oblong stated that he was already fully aware of the situation, and that his status more than qualified him for the role. The judge politely asked for Michael's opinion on the matter, and upon receiving his approval, Sil offered up an idea of her own. Now that a new guardian had been named, the details of the account books previously kept by Sorvel needed to be made public as well. The meticulous Duke Oblong immediately caught on to the issue at hand. Iron ore was a resource that required strict oversight, and based on the quantity that had gone missing, Sorvel could very well be charged with treason against the crown. If it turned out to be a minor amount, it might not be much of an issue. But with a duke of royal blood like Oblong now involved, Sorvel was bound to face serious trouble either way. Hearing this, Sorvel's expression shifted at once. She returned the head of household ring to Michael, claiming she had only been keeping it safe on his behalf. And with that, she hurried away. As the 4 of them watched Sorvel's retreat, the whole matter came to a perfect close. The judge then announced the details of the new guardianship, with the term lasting until Michael came of age, and with the matter now settled once and for all, the judge turned his attention to Michael. As a member of the Empire's Council of Ministers, he had long been aware of House Laxia's troubles. He found himself looking forward to the day, a year from now, when this composed, resilient young man would successfully take his place as head of the house. The silver-haired family had finally returned to the right path, and the hidden legend of this family was about to come to light. With the guardianship trial now concluded, Duke Oblong and the children set off together in the carriage home. This, incidentally, was the first time the 2 of them had properly met. Looking at Sil's youthful face, the Duke found it hard to believe that the one who had cured his granddaughter Ilya was nothing more than a little girl, a condition the capital's clergy had found utterly hopeless, even concluding she would never wake up at all. And yet somehow the young lady of House Laxia sitting before him had found a way to solve it. Watching the Duke express his gratitude so emotionally, his straightforward, sincere nature reminded her so much of the very first Duke 80 years ago, who had always worn his feelings openly, without holding anything back, which was exactly why he had once been such an important ally to Sil in leading the Empire. Sil asked how his plan was coming along. Duke Oblong had practically become a one-man demolition crew. After making a massive donation to the monastery, he'd begun excavating for holy relics. Sil had made it explicit in her letter that he needed to find a relic imbued with divine power, no matter what it took, and place it at the bedside of his granddaughter. And Sil's plan turned out to be remarkably effective. Ilya, who had been unconscious for days, soon opened her eyes. This only spurred Duke Oblong to work even harder, digging up the grand ducal residence in the capital and the surrounding grounds. It was hard to imagine that the aging Duke Oblong could be moved to such lengths for his granddaughter's recovery. And this was exactly the deal Sil had struck with him. Duke Oblong would become guardian to the three siblings. In exchange, Sil would restore Ilya's body to full health. Though Lady Ilya had already woken up, a complete cure would still require a slow, careful process. Until then, Sil hoped Duke Oblong would take real care in overseeing Michael's education as heir. Hearing this, Duke Oblong readily agreed, and expressed his wish to stay as a guest at House Laxia's estate for a few days. The carriage soon crossed into House Laxia's territory. Sil found herself curious. What kind of reaction would Duke Oblong have if he knew his granddaughter's illness had actually been a curse, not a disease? And more importantly, who exactly had cast that dark curse on the Duke's granddaughter in the first place? The very moment the three Laxia siblings arrived home, the servants who had once been dismissed were already waiting for them at the estate's gate. The instant they'd received Robin's letter, they had rushed straight back. The maid who had once tried to talk Robin out of staying was now in tears. She could only imagine how much Robin must have gone through during all the time they'd been away. But now the hardest part was finally behind them. Robin, for her part, simply felt she'd done nothing more than what any responsible adult would have done. That night, the three Laxia siblings sat down to the most lavish dinner they'd had in years, and those who had returned quickly settled back into the rhythm of life at the estate. Michael called out to his sister, hoping to have a talk with her. Out on the balcony, watching the family finally return to its rightful path. This happiness left Michael feeling as though it were all somehow unreal. He wanted to ask a favor of Silly. A moment later, Sil felt something heavy pressed into her palm. It was the head of household ring. Michael wanted his sister to hold on to it for him until next year's succession ceremony. In past succession ceremonies, it had always been the parents who placed the ring on their children's hand, a gesture marking the formal appointment of the heir. But now, with their parents gone, Michael wanted this ring to be placed on his hand by his sister herself. This chance had been hard-won for Sil, and he had no intention of letting her effort go to waste. The two of them made a promise. Sil would keep the ring safe until the day of the succession ceremony arrived. In the days that followed, Sorvel was imprisoned under imperial law on charges of physical assault, while Duke Oblong stayed as a guest. He patiently taught Michael how to properly review the account books, and Michael, soaking it all up like a sponge in water, quickly mastered every bit of knowledge the Duke had to offer. Before long, he'd uncovered evidence of Sorvel's embezzlement all on his own. Not only did they recover the stolen funds, but Sorvel was also sentenced to exile. In hopes of a reduced sentence, she sent a letter of repentance every week, but not a single one of those letters ever reached the children's hands. Robin burned every last one of them without a second thought. With so many people returning, the Laxia estate quickly regained its former vitality, full of life and warmth once again. Though it still fell short of the grandeur from 80 years ago, the relaxed smiles now on Rita's and Michael's faces were something no one had ever seen there before. That night, Sil lay in bed, staring at the ring in her hand. She'd only meant to borrow it for a little while, never expecting things to go this smoothly. There had always been a legend passed down within House Laxia that at the exact moment the first dewdrop of morning formed, if one went to the room with the portrait on the second floor and opened the door with a hand wearing the signet ring, the water itself would guide the way forward to a secret place hidden deep within House Laxia. No use hiding it any longer. There was simply no covering up Sil's status as a rich heiress anymore. The Dewdrop Chamber was a place where the elves had once channeled their magic for the very first Duke of Laxia, and it could only be entered at exactly 5 in the morning when the dew condensed. Hidden deep within the Laxia estate, nothing inside was ever touched by the passage of time. Jewelry and ornaments were no exception. Not only did the gems retain their original luster, even the finest details of the craftsmanship showed no sign of wear at all. Sil quickly began searching through everything. She'd just pick out a few of the finest pieces, plus a bit of gold artwork, and that would do. A moment later, a whole room full of gold and jewels left Sil feeling rather moved. Thankfully, in her past life, she'd pestered her brother until she learned about this place. Otherwise, she'd have missed her one shot at being a rich heiress in this life entirely. With that, Sil dragged over a small ladder and climbed up, following her memory. She soon found a small box tucked away in a hidden compartment. The radiant rainbow necklace was right there inside. Come to think of it, Leon really had been quite shrewd sometimes. Not one item marked as an important family treasure in this room had ever been touched. All of it kept intact, so future generations could carry on the stories of those who came before. Looking at the necklace in her hands, Sil couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness, thinking of her brother. But for the sake of the family, she decided to make temporary use of it anyway. She then set aside a few large gold bars and a fair amount of silver coins as well. That should be more than enough to fund House Laxia's fresh start. Just then, the portrait of the very first head of the family hanging nearby caught Sil's attention. Laxia, a hero whose name stood alongside the 5 original founding dukes. When House Laxia was first established, relations between humans and elves began to grow harmonious. Humans had once looked down on the elves for their strikingly different appearance. While the elves in turn resented humanity's brutality, it was around this time that an evil force appeared within human territory, and the war that broke out in the name of protection brought the two races, once so at odds, together in mutual understanding. They took great pride in serving under House Laxia as their lord, and as a gesture of gratitude, the elves left behind several spells for House Laxia, as a symbol of their friendship. One of them was the dewdrop chamber itself. Thinking of this, Sil bowed respectfully to her ancestor's portrait. It was thanks to the dewdrop chamber left behind by the first head of the family that House Laxia had managed to rise again after falling into obscurity. Just then, for some reason, Sil felt the portrait before her looked strangely lifelike, and the instant her hand brushed against the painting, a powerful surge of magic swept over her all at once. Leon had once warned his sister that with her magical power she should never touch anything in this room carelessly. Back then, Leon had never told her why, but now Sil understood. The portrait had been concealing a teleportation spell all along. The next moment, Sil found herself sent sprawling flat on her face. Without a single shred of dignity befitting a duke's daughter, Sil couldn't quite wrap her head around it. How could there possibly be a teleportation spell hidden in her great-grandmother's own portrait? Teleportation magic might sound simple, but it was actually incredibly dangerous. It involved breaking the body down into tiny fragments, then reassembling them at another location, which was exactly why Sil now felt sore absolutely everywhere. Opening her eyes in a daze, she realized the head of household ring was missing from her hand. Could it have slipped off while she was tumbling around just now, just as she was wondering about this? A chameleon in the bushes came crawling out with the ring clamped in its mouth. For a brief moment, the two of them simply stared at each other in stunned silence. Then the chameleon, snapping out of it first, bolted away. Sil's furious shouts echoed after it as it fled. Meanwhile, the commotion also woke a sleeping boy nearby. Kiska slowly sat up, softly calling out for Bibi. Where had that timid, gentle little creature run off to this time? But the moment he looked up, Kiska noticed the floor was somehow glowing. As Sil's furious shouting reached his ears once more, though a little exasperated, he still picked up a weapon just in case. What kind of idiot intruder doesn't even know to keep it down? Kiska followed the glowing trail across the floor. The next moment, Sil, still running, nearly collided head-on with Kiske. A 12-year-old intruder left Kiska momentarily stunned. Sil, for her part, was just as speechless. On top of the sudden teleportation spell and a runaway chameleon, now there was apparently a member of the royal family here too. A moment later, Sil scratched her head. Oh, so this is the palace. But clearly her rambling made no sense to Kiske either. He simply asked who she was and what she was doing sneaking into the palace. After all, the palace was the very heart of the Val Empire. Sil tried to explain she'd just wandered in without really meaning to, but Kiske gave her a look that said he wasn't buying it for a second. Realizing plain words weren't going to cut it, Sil promptly cast a spell to prove exactly who she was. A stream of magic swirled around Kiska and froze solid in midair. She'd hoped this would make it clear she was a genius mage, but her display seemed to go right over his head. Kiske didn't seem impressed in the slightest, only curious. So, was it you who made the floor light up earlier too? Hearing this, Sil felt a little embarrassed. It turned out certain minerals in the marble really did react to magic. Sil then asked for his name. Well, time for another battle of wits. Sil went first, borrowing her late brother's name. I'm Leon. Not to be outdone, Kiske answered in kind. Nova Franders. The moment the words left his mouth, the air itself seemed to freeze. The name Kiske had given clearly belonged to the long-extinct kingdom of Buscanti. Kiske, for his part, remarked that even his dog would know Sil's name belonged to a boy. The air froze over once more. Sil Laxia, Kiske Ramov. The boy, so fierce on the surface, found himself flustered right from their very first meeting. After their little battle of wits was over, Sil quickly explained what she'd actually come for. She was just about to ask if he'd seen a chameleon anywhere, when the very next moment she spotted the culprit herself, only to realize the chameleon was actually Kiski's pet, BB. This was a pet his great-grandfather had entrusted to him, though something about that name struck Sil as oddly familiar, before Sil could react. But Kiska's expression grew more serious than usual. He asked bluntly whether mages were always like this. Hearing this, Sil pressed her lips together. It seemed Kiska carried some deep misunderstanding about mages, though she had no idea where it had come from. Sil simply went about casting her spell without much thought. BB, now full from drinking water, quickly spat out the ring. With that done, Sil said nothing more, and turned to leave. Seeing this, Kiska gave her an odd look. Do you even know what kind of place the palace is? Hearing this, Sil blinked in confusion. Isn't the palace just the emperor's residence? What's there to explain? Kiska gave up trying to explain that wandering around freely would get her arrested by the guards. Instead, he simply pointed in another direction. You're going the wrong way. Not willing to back down, Sil argued back once more. How could a supposedly great mage not even know her way around? Sil found herself getting a little annoyed just thinking about it. What has my star pupil Fram been up to? How did mages end up with such a terrible reputation after I died? Kiska sighed and gave up on the argument entirely, only telling her that next time she'd need to submit a formal request before entering the palace. Hearing this, Sil couldn't resist teasing him. Do you want to see me again that badly? The blunt remark left Kiska's face completely red. Seeing this, Sil's smile only widened. Once you're a bit older, those long eyelashes of yours are going to attract plenty of young noblewomen. Hearing this, Kiska found himself completely tongue-tied. What a strange young noblewoman she was. Sneaking into the palace uninvited was one thing, but treating a prince like some little kid on top of it. Mages really were a strange bunch, it seemed. Sil pressed her palm against the marble floor, and once again, the floor reacted to her magic. Seeing this, Sil quickly pieced together the truth. This must have been the passage the first duke once used for secret meetings with the emperor, since the palace had wards in place to disrupt teleportation coordinates. A standard teleportation spell simply couldn't reach it, which was why they'd chosen instead to link the portrait to the palace garden. Before leaving, there was one more thing Sil wanted to ask. Do you know someone named Maximilian? He should be your great-grandfather. Sil found herself picturing that familiar face. Her second disciple, once wounded in the war against the demon god. She had no idea how Maximilian was doing these days, whether he'd lived a happy life or not. Hearing this, Kiski was momentarily stunned. The man Sil was talking about was indeed his great-grandfather, and he was still alive and well. Paying no mind to the shock written across Sil's face, Kiska continued, Maximilian Ramov was both the current emperor of the empire and his own great-grandfather. But before he could even finish speaking, Sil's teleportation spell had already activated, his remaining words still lingering in the air behind her. No wonder Sil had felt such a strange sense of familiarity upon seeing that blonde-haired boy and his chameleon. It had all happened so long ago, back when Maximilian had been nothing more than an ordinary prince. The first time they met, he'd tried to steal Sil's holy sword. It wasn't until Maximilian was thoroughly humiliated by Sil on the training grounds that he completely changed his attitude toward her. From then on, the moment he saw Sil, he'd cling desperately to her leg, making it painfully clear he'd rather die than not become her disciple. It drove Sil absolutely up the wall. He had no talent for magic at all, yet stubbornly insisted on learning swordsmanship from her. By the time Sil died at 24, she'd taken on 2 disciples. Her first disciple, Fram, had once been a boy left to wander the streets because of the dark cult, until, quite by chance, he caught Sil's attention and became her very first student. After taking Fram in, Sil had thought she would never take on a second disciple in her lifetime. But life, as it turned out, was full of surprises. Taking Maximilian on as a student was one of them. Not long after, Maximilian came running to Fram in tears. Even though Fram had already refused him countless times, he still begged Fram to save his pet BB. In response, Fram firmly believed in the natural cycle of life, that all living things were born, grew old, fell ill, and died, and that not even a tiny chameleon could escape that fate. But Maximilian's sheer persistence went beyond anything anyone could have imagined. In order to save a pet that would only live a few years anyway, he knelt on the ground and refused to eat for an entire week straight. Sil herself had tried to talk him out of it, pointing out that even if Fram concocted a life-restoring potion, His pet would still die eventually. But Maximilian's reasoning was simple enough. To him, the chameleon BB was his friend, and he couldn't just give up on him simply because fate couldn't be changed. If his master or brother Fram were ever dying, he said, he'd beg for help just as desperately without a moment's hesitation. He was a child who treasured life above all else. And in the end, unable to bear the constant pestering any longer, Fram finally developed the life-restoring potion. This kid had been crying his eyes out outside the whole time, nearly interrupting his research on more than one occasion. Seeing this, Maximilian's tears welled up all over again. He declared outright that Fram was the best brother in the whole world. Sil had always assumed he must have passed away long ago. After all, her brother Leon, his wife, and their nephew were all long gone. She'd been afraid that hoping for anything more would only lead to disappointment, so she'd never once let herself think it might be otherwise. Until Kiske revealed the truth. Back in her room, Sil's heart remained unsettled for a long while. The instant she'd seen his blonde hair and red eyes, she had recognized Kiske's royal bloodline right away. She just never expected he would turn out to be Maximilian's own great-grandson. Being alive really was an incredible thing. The truth of the past had lain buried beneath the passing years. Upon learning news of an old companion, Sil decided to go explore this world for herself. Not long before, Sil had gone to find Duke Oblong. Hearing that Sil wasn't feeling well, the Duke had waited several full days before finally paying her a visit. The investigation Sil had arranged had already turned up solid leads. Near Duke Oblong's own residence, they had found a blood-stained talisman and the corpse of a black snake, exactly matching what Sil had suspected. The Duke's face was etched with anxiety, but before telling him the truth, Sil still asked him to make a promise first. That he would never reveal the details of their arrangement to anyone, and that he would never misuse the magical knowledge he'd gained from this whole affair. Once she had his firm agreement, Sil finally began explaining what had truly happened. To his granddaughter, Ilya, the young lady wasn't sick at all, she'd been cursed. Though the Duke insisted Ilya wasn't the kind of child who'd make enemies, Sil believed nothing in this world was truly impossible. The story reported in the papers had fabricated an illness called the Black Cloud, but in truth, its proper name should have been the Black Serpent's Curse. The object used to cast the curse had been found near the Duke's own residence. Since Lady Ilya herself was in the capital, the greater physical distance from the source explained why her symptoms had progressed so slowly. Duke Oblong stared blankly at Silly. These were secrets far beyond what any 12-year-old should ever have to know. Sil continued speaking. Casting a curse required magical power, but there was also a far more potent method. That was life sacrifice. Whether blood or the essence of plants, every living thing in this world carried magic within it. And drawing power through the sacrifice of life was the very foundation of dark magic. Someone had used a black snake as the sacrificial vessel to spread the curse, capable of turning a person's entire body black within 1 week to 6 months. But the truly terrifying part was that snakes shed their skin. If left unchecked, Ilya's own skin and hair would eventually fall away entirely, just like a snake shedding its skin. This was exactly what made dark magic and the dark cult so terrifying. The resentment generated by sacrificing just a single snake was enough to cast a curse this powerful. Which was also why, to anyone unable to tell mages apart from dark mages, everything about magic seemed dangerous and suspicious. But for now, the immediate crisis had already been resolved. The Duke had placed the holy relic exactly where Sil had instructed. As for the object used as the curse's medium, Sil said she would personally destroy it herself. Hearing this, Duke Oblong still found it hard to believe. But the very next moment, a powerful surge of magic began to flicker in front of Sil. A mage of only 12 years old, left even the well-traveled Duke Oblong utterly astonished. The mysterious power that mages commanded could reshape the very laws of the world through boundless knowledge. And the first head of House Laxia had shared a deep friendship with that powerful race of magic wielders, the elves. Seeing the Duke still somewhat dazed, Sil smiled and explained that she would personally travel to the capital to handle the rest herself, even though lifting a curse was no small feat. For someone with Sil's current abilities, it was really nothing more than a trivial task. That night, the conversation with Sil left Duke Oblong unable to collect his thoughts for a long while. What he saw as an unpredictable crisis, Sil had handled with complete composure, arranging everything with ease. Next, they needed to investigate the water sources. Since flowing water could serve as a medium for spreading magic, there had to be some closely connected waterway linking the cursed object to Ilya in the capital. In that moment, Sil's confidence practically shone in her very eyes. Her every word brimming with logic and wisdom, Duke Oblong felt as though he were watching the rise of a new emperor for the empire. He took a wistful drag of his pipe. He had consulted countless healers over the course of treating his granddaughter, but none of them had ever left him as stunned as Sil had. Sensing Ilya's curse from 1,000 miles away, even though she'd had every piece of information from the very start, she'd only offered a preliminary plan at first, simply to gently keep the upper hand in their negotiation. For a moment, Duke Oblong felt as though he weren't dealing with a child at all, but with a leader of profound wisdom. Meanwhile, Sil went to the study to remind her brother Michael it was time for dinner. Seeing his sister, Michael found himself curious about when they'd be leaving for the capital. With the family back on solid footing, he, as her older brother, no longer had to worry about money and could finally accompany his siblings on the trip. Ritus's sword tournament would likely wrap up within about a month. Michael decided to take his siblings out shopping properly without holding back. As a duchess, Sil would surely need at least 100 or so new outfits. Even though there were more pressing matters at hand than shopping, Sil still decided for now not to worry Michael and to deal with it later. At the dinner table, Ritus's seat remained empty as always. This guy was so busy training with his sword that if Robin hadn't been bringing him meals, he probably would have starved to death right there on the training grounds. Watching Ritus now, Sil couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. Even though Michael had strongly opposed it at the time, Ritus had still gone ahead and dropped out of the academy, claiming on the surface he was simply tired of the coursework. But deep down, Michael always knew that the real reason he'd given it up was fear of burdening the family with tuition costs. And now that the family situation had improved, Ritus had found himself a new goal. He wanted to become a member of the Royal Guard. And for the sake of that dream, he kept pushing himself day and night without rest. Returning after 80 years, Sil still felt a warm, familiar sense of belonging here. The now crumbling training hall still carried the weight of the glorious first half of Sil's life. Not long before, Ritus had trained late into the night before finally returning to the estate. In the corridor, late at night, he ran into his sister Sil, who had been waiting to intercept him. Since her brother was always nowhere to be found while practicing his swordsmanship, Sil had no choice but to block his path. On his way back to his room, no matter what, skipping dinner simply wasn't an option. Watching Ritus now, Sil couldn't help but think of her own past self, who had also ignored everything else in life, chasing after a single goal. Unable to talk his sister out of it, Ritus reluctantly agreed to pay more attention to his health from now on. It was around this time that Sil grew curious about the real reason Ritus had dropped out of the academy. Even though the family now had plenty of funds, Ritus still showed no interest in returning. Faced with his sister's persistent questioning, Ritus could only pinch her cheeks. "This is grown-up business, don't worry about it." But even so, Sil couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. For him to keep up such rigorous training even without anyone forcing him to at the ducal estate, what exactly had made Ritus drop out of school in the first place? Soon enough, the day came for Duke Oblong to depart. Worried that Michael would have no one to guide him, he arranged for the very tutor who had once trained his own son to serve as Michael's heir tutor. Before leaving, he reminded Michael that they should make regular visits to each other's territories. After all, book learning alone was never the whole picture. And since Ritus was about to compete in the Callister sword tournament, the two families would soon be reunited in the capital anyway. Concerned that House Laxia currently had nowhere to stay in the capital, he warmly invited them to stay at his own residence instead. The only thing Sil found herself curious about was whether the current emperor, His Majesty Maximilian, would be attending the sword tournament. But the Duke wasn't entirely sure himself. After all, the current emperor was already quite advanced in age. Hearing this, Sil felt a wave of relief wash over her. As long as he was still alive, that was all that mattered. She only wished, from a distance, to catch a glimpse of this old friend she hadn't seen in 80 long years. Before long, the Duke formally set out for the capital. He would arrange for his third son, Kayuk, to handle receiving the three siblings. That evening, Sil gathered together the servants and knights who had returned to the family. Seeing House Laxia restored to life once more, Sil found herself grateful for Robin's decision all those years ago. She soon announced her plan to head to the capital, and asked that everyone here please look after the estate while she was away. The returning servants all assured her that they would have the estate looking brand new by the time she returned. The Callister sword tournament, held regularly by Duke Ibetta, typically drew large crowds from all 5 of the Empire's great ducal houses, and given the current state of affairs in the world, Sil decided she needed to witness it all with her own eyes. A few days later, at Duke Oblong's residence in the capital, the moment they arrived, a maid reported on Lady Ilya's current condition. Thanks to Sil's treatment plan, Ilya's health had been steadily improving, and the moment she saw her grandfather, Ilya looked absolutely delighted. Even as he watched Ilya's condition improve, the black patches still remaining on her skin still made Duke Oblong's heart clench painfully. He knew plenty of people held grudges against the family, but to target an innocent, fragile child had crossed a line Duke Oblong simply couldn't forgive. He was determined to root out whoever was behind this. Upon learning of his grandfather's arrival, Duke Oblong's third son, Kayuki, came at once to pay his respects. Seeing her brother, Ilya looked overjoyed as well. It was around this time that Duke Oblong brought up the matter of hosting the Laxia family, placing particular emphasis on Sil. It was only then that Kayak recalled this lady of House Laxia, whose name carried little weight these days. Though he had no idea why, his grandfather kept looking at him with an expression that clearly said, "I have high hopes for you." As the capital of the empire, Balfron, thrived under the joint governance of the 5 great ducal houses. 80 years later, Sil found herself back here once again. The lively marketplace, the sprawling plazas, even though plenty of things still fell short of what they once were, Sil still felt a persistent sense of familiarity throughout. It was only the temple, now in ruins, that no longer carried any of its former glory. Ever since Sil had thoroughly defeated the demon god in her past life, the number of worshippers coming to pray had steadily declined. For some reason, Sil couldn't shake a lingering sense of loss. Before long, the group arrived at Duke Oblong's residence in the capital. Faced with the grand welcoming ceremony before them, Michael, once so down on his luck, found himself momentarily stunned. While Radis and Sil both realized that putting on a polite smile was exhausting work in its own right. That night, a blazing fireplace filled the room with warmth and comfort. Both of her brothers had already gone off to register for the sword tournament, giving Sil a rare moment to simply relax and enjoy the quiet. Sil sat looking over the newspaper in her hands. The Callister sword tournament had drawn enormous attention. From the preliminaries all the way to the final round, the whole event was accompanied by a string of celebrations. And the young competitors' duels made for thrilling viewing. Sil found herself scheming quietly to herself. Once Rydis won and stood before the Emperor as champion, if she got to tag along as a family member, she was already looking forward to seeing crybaby Maximilian's reaction all over again. Just then, an attendant came to announce that a guest had arrived. Though Sil mentioned it wasn't a convenient time to receive visitors, upon learning it was Kayak, she changed her mind. As the liaison appointed by Duke Oblong himself, he apparently wished to visit Sil privately. Though she had no idea whether this was the Duke's doing or Kayuk's own initiative, it still piqued Sil's curiosity. She was rather curious to see just what kind of person this young lord of House Oblong turned out to be. The prodigy who had once stood at the very peak of the empire was now, of all things, being mistaken for some lovesick little sister. Faced with a Kayuk practically overflowing with self-importance, Sil finally couldn't hold back her laughter. Not long before, upon learning that House Oblong's third son had come looking for her, Sil had hesitated only briefly, before deciding to see exactly what kind of person he was. Meanwhile, Kayak waited patiently in the parlor. He checked himself in the mirror, still looking sharp today as always. His outfit, too, was perfectly put together, setting off his impeccable looks to perfection, thinking of his grandfather's instructions to take good care of the third young lady of House Laxia, though the way he'd spoken about her suggested she was no ordinary girl. Kayak still, deep down, thought of Sil as nothing more than an ordinary 12-year-old. He only hoped she wouldn't end up too infatuated with him to think straight. Just then, Sil appeared before Kayak as well. Kayak immediately dismissed his guards and greeted Sil politely, but the hand kiss he offered very nearly made Sil's jaw drop in shock. A hand kiss was typically a gesture of respect toward an elder or an honored guest, but it was also often used to hint at romantic interest. Either way, Sil found Kayak more than a little strange. Still, mindful of proper etiquette for a young lady, Sil decided to simply observe quietly for now. But Sil's calm composure left Kayak momentarily at a loss. Normally, after he expressed his interest like that, a girl would at least blush a little, assuming Sil simply hadn't caught his meaning. Kayak decided to be a bit more direct. He said he worried she'd be lonely and offered to show her around the estate later. With that, the corner of his mouth curled into a smile, He couldn't imagine any girl failing to fall for him with a move like that. But hearing this, Sil flatly turned down the invitation, even giving him a look as if he were some kind of fool. Kayuk, thoroughly exasperated, assumed something must have gone wrong with his introduction, so he brought up his hobbies instead, horseback riding and admiring his own reflection. While there was nothing inherently wrong with a bit of self-admiration, the sheer volume at which he announced it left Sil momentarily wide-eyed. He looked like some sort of glowing fool, and Sil found herself utterly speechless. She thought to herself that if she ever ran into him during the sword tournament, she'd absolutely have to beat him until he cried. It was around then that Kayuk grew curious about the relationship between Sil and his grandfather. Sil had no intention of explaining it to him, and simply told him he could go ask Duke Oblong himself. Fortunately, a guard chose that moment to announce that Michael and Ritas had returned. Otherwise, Sil genuinely felt she couldn't have kept up the conversation much longer. Kayuk, for his part, knew when to take a hint. As the liaison appointed by the Duke, he simply told her to reach out any time if she needed anything, then turned and left. Before long, Kayuk stayed on to join the 3 Laxia siblings for dinner. He clearly received the finest education a ducal household could offer. His exchanges with Michael were courteous but kept brief, a stark contrast to how he'd behaved when alone with Sil. Though Sil had no idea what Duke Oblong was thinking, sending this guy over, his flashy peacock-like display, still left her more than a little irritated. Kayuk Oblong, thanks for making me feel sick. After dinner, Sil instructed the maids to prepare some tea and refreshments. Duke Oblong truly lived up to his status as one of the Empire's 5 great dukes. Even the tea served to guests was of the finest quality. Before long, Kayuk arrived right on time. Even though she wasn't particularly fond of him, Sil still needed the information he could provide. Kayuk, for his part, showed remarkable poise, as befitted a noble guest of the ducal household. He assured her he would do everything he could to meet her requests. A proper heir's education showed itself in knowing how to steer a conversation in all kinds of situations. Faced with a more serious side of Kayuk, Sil found herself setting aside her earlier assumptions about him. He might be a bit flashy, but deep down she decided he wasn't a bad person. The two of them chatted on and off, even though Sil herself had traveled to the capital countless times in her past life. This body of hers was setting foot here for the very first time, and the years had changed the capital dramatically from what she once knew. Sil casually brought up Ilya's condition, pretending she knew nothing about it. Kayuk's expression darkened the moment the topic came up. He mentioned bluntly that most healers claiming to cure illnesses were nothing more than frauds peddling so-called ancestral remedies. It was only then that Sil learned mages, once found across the entire continent, were now on the verge of vanishing almost completely. The study of magic, once a formal subject taught at the academy, had been cut from the curriculum well over a decade ago. Hearing this, Sil worked hard to keep her composure, which meant mages nowadays had practically no place in the Empire at all, and even Kayuk had no idea why. Sil quickly changed the subject. Expressing her relief at Ilya's recovery, Kayuk too seemed deeply grateful for it. Not long ago, Ilya's condition had nearly terrified the entire household, with black patches spreading across her body. It had given Kayuk more than one nightmare, dreaming that his sister would lie there and never wake up again. Now that she was recovering, the whole tense household could finally breathe a sigh of relief. But it was clear Kayuk had no idea his sister had actually been cursed. Duke Oblong had kept the secret well. Sil then finally got to the point, bringing up the box the Duke had ordered sent to the capital. At this, Kayuk immediately boasted that it was thanks entirely to him that they'd managed to find the box at all. Hearing this, Sil's interest was instantly piqued, and she quickly asked for the details of how they'd found it. The box had been discovered near a well behind the Duke's residence, in a spot where the ground had clearly been freshly dug. Just an ordinary wooden box, wrapped in an old cloth. Hearing this, Sil's expression changed. That was the extent of what Kayuk knew. The very object used to curse the Duke's granddaughter had been carelessly wrapped and buried in the ground without even the slightest attempt at containment. Not even bothering to hide the marks left by the digging. The whole affair felt suspiciously easy, which left Sil more than a little suspicious. That someone had planted a spy within Duke Oblong's own household, and that the wooden box itself had likely been left there deliberately, as a decoy. With this in mind, Sil asked to see what was inside the box. But hearing this, Kayuk looked rather taken aback. He refused Sil's request outright, refusing her again and again, just so that Sil might get the chance to give him a good beating. Such an outrageous request. Sil had never encountered anything like it in her entire life. Not long before, Sil had simply wanted to examine the evidence of the curse they'd dug up. But to her surprise, Kayuk had flatly refused. Hearing this, Sil was completely at a loss. It was obvious this was all for Ilya's sake, but Kayuk was all too familiar with excuses like that. For Ilya's sake, again. That was exactly what every con artist he'd ever thrown out had said too. Even when Sil tried invoking the Duke's authority to pressure him, Kayuk simply told her to go right ahead, completely unbothered. In truth, the box itself meant nothing to Kayuk. What he really cared about was what his grandfather had said. That Sil would grow into someone truly remarkable one day. He'd approached her with a critical eye, and even though she displayed a composure and depth of thought far beyond her years, to Kayuk that was still all it amounted to. He even suspected Sil was simply taking advantage of his naive grandfather, which was why he looked at her with such contempt. The weak have no right to make demands, but hearing this, Sil actually let out a sigh of relief. Well, that made things simple enough. So he just wanted to get beaten up, did he? Go get your weapon. On the training grounds? Kayuk couldn't shake the feeling that this whole situation felt like some kind of dream. Sil had completely ignored him since the moment they'd arrived, simply warming herself up on her own. He, who had trained in swordsmanship since he was a child, had never once tasted defeat among his peers. Assuming Sil might be venting her anger over his earlier provocation, Kayuk felt a small pang of disappointment, not wanting Sil to get hurt. He'd actually considered calling off this pointless match, but the look in Sil's eyes was as unwavering as if she were about to enlist for war. Kayuk was in for a beating, and not a single bit less than he deserved. The rules of the match were simple. Drop your weapon or step out of bounds, and you lose. As the match began, Kayuk had no intention of wasting any time. Thinking to end it in one decisive strike, he charged straight at Sil. In the blink of an eye, he was already right in front of her. As he raised his long sword high, relying on the speed he took such pride in, he was confident the fight would be over the moment the blade came down. But the very next instant, Sil had already dodged his attack with ease. The pride he carried as a gifted prodigy felt utterly powerless in Sil's hands. The next moment, every opening in his stance turned into a burst of pain across his body. In the blink of an eye, it felt as though countless blades had sliced across his skin, as Sil's wooden sword came crashing down hard on his shoulder. Kayuk felt like he was caught in some kind of dream, but the pain running through his body was undeniably real. He looked over at Sil. Her hands were unmistakably soft and delicate. Without a single trace of ever having trained with a sword, he couldn't find any actual flaw in his own swordsmanship either. It was simply that Sil was too fast, so fast that he couldn't react in time no matter what he tried. The pride he'd buried deep inside since childhood kept Kayuk from admitting defeat easily. He fought desperately to block Sil's attacks, but the fact that she was clearly holding back only made him feel all the more helpless, like a mouse being toyed with by a cat. The next moment, Kayuk raised his hand without hesitation and admitted defeat. Back at the residence, Kayuk loudly complained about how much everything hurt. All Sil could do was roll her eyes at him. If you'd just handed over the box sooner, none of this would have happened. Some people just needed a good beating before they'd listen. But Sil couldn't be bothered to lecture him any further. Having finally seen inside the box, she now felt fully confident about curing Ilya. It was only then that Kayuk finally learned his sister had been cursed. Duke Oblong's frequent visits to House Laxia's territory had all along simply been about reaching this very deal with the girl standing before him. In that instant, Kayuk felt as though everything he'd done up to this point had made him look like nothing more than a fool. Sil soon set off to visit Lady Ilya. Ilya's curse couldn't be allowed to wait any longer. Duke Oblong instructed his guards to bring Sil everything she needed. Inside was the finest sword the Oblong estate had to offer. After enhancing it with magic, Sil handed it over to Kayuk. The moment this box is opened, the curse will surge straight toward Ilya. At that point, Kayuk's job was to protect Ilya and use the sword to strike down the cursed serpent. To avoid any accidental harm, Sil instructed the two accompanying guards to be absolutely certain not to act rashly. The moment they stepped into the room, the thick stench of the curse sent a shiver even through Sil. Fortunately, the holy relic the Duke had found proved powerful enough. Looking at Ilya deep in sleep, Sil cast another deep sleep spell over her once more. Now came the actual work of lifting the curse. As Sil opened the box containing the cursed object, a thick black mist spread through the room, leaving everyone present with an oppressive, suffocating feeling. But the curse didn't stop there. The dark power surged straight toward the ceiling, and in an instant took the form of a massive black serpent. Its cold, slitted eyes gleamed. As it lunged straight for Ilya, fortunately Kayuk struck in time with Syl's magic-imbued sword. But the serpent, driven back, suddenly bared its fangs and lunged at Kayuk instead. Startled by this strange behavior from the cursed creature, Syl quickly went back to examine the inscribed incantation once more. The next moment she saw something utterly unbelievable. The curse's true target had never been Ilya at all. It was the entire House of Oblong. By now, Kayuk, drained of strength, was barely holding on. As the massive serpent prepared to strike again, in that critical moment, Syl managed to destroy the medium of the curse just in time. With everything resolved, the Duke came rushing in as well, relieved to find everyone safe and sound. Ilya, too, stirred awake from her deep sleep, though she'd nearly woken on her own before Silly had forced her back into a few more hours of sleep, leaving the young lady, still groggy from oversleeping, more than a little dazed. With the Black Serpent's curse now behind them, after confirmation from the healers, Lady Ilya was declared completely safe and sound. As the dark cloud hanging over House Oblong finally lifted, the Duke's eyes, as he looked at Syl, were filled with gratitude. But Syl merely waved it off casually, attributing it all to their arrangement. She didn't want anyone to feel burdened by it. Yet the Duke understood full well what kindness lay behind Syl's words, even though he was obligated to serve as House Laxia's guardian. Even if House Laxia had fallen further still, there was no real need for her to go through so much trouble to lift the curse for him. He could easily have found another guardian for the children instead. To the Duke, Syl, who had chosen to help others in her own way, was nothing short of an angel come down to earth. Duke Oblong then declared that he would continue fulfilling his duties, right up until Michael's formal succession ceremony. It was only now that Kayuk truly understood just what kind of power lay behind the remarkable person his grandfather had spoken of. But Syl's expression suddenly turned serious. This matter of the curse wasn't fully resolved yet. Normally, a curse like this would target one specific person, but this particular curse, the one that had struck House Oblong, had somehow targeted the entire family instead. Given how long the ducal house's history stretched back, it would be difficult to pin down exactly who the hidden enemy might be. But the careless way the medium had been buried this time led Syl to believe this whole incident had merely been a test run, which meant House Oblong could very well be facing an even more terrifying curse down the road. Syl generously assured him that she'd be willing to help again if it ever came to that. Meanwhile, House Oblong's chief healer had recently fallen into serious financial trouble because of gambling debts. It was right around then that someone had approached him, promising that if he agreed to bury the box, he'd be paid 3 million gold coins. Once he realized his actions might come to light, he hurried anxiously to make his way back to the ducal residence to gather some information. The instant he turned around, a single cat abruptly appeared in his line of sight. The next moment, the black cat's pupils suddenly turned red, and before he even realized it, he found himself standing on the railing of a bridge. The peerless beauty who had once shone at the very peak of the empire 80 years ago. The peerless beauty who had once shone at the very peak of the empire 80 years ago had turned Kayuk into a complete nuisance, sticking to her like glue, following Syl around every day, playing the violin. Meanwhile, Emperor Maximilian suddenly fell gravely ill. Upon hearing the news, Kisuke grew frantic with worry. But the moment he stepped into the hall, he was scolded for making too much noise with his footsteps. Second consort Europa had been born into House Celt, one of the empire's 5 great ducal families. After marrying the second prince, who was Kiska's uncle, she took on the responsibility of caring for him within the palace, following the second prince's mysterious death. Not wanting to disturb his grandfather, Kiska simply bowed quietly, looking at his grandfather still lost in a deep sleep. Kiski turned to look at the ministers gathered in the room, but every one of them avoided meeting his eyes. None of them understood the cause of the illness either. All they could do was gently pull back the emperor's blankets. The emperor's skin, aged yet still fair, was now covered in black patches, but the ministers had absolutely no idea what this condition even was, which meant, faced with Kisuke's desperate worry, they too felt just as powerless. Second consort Europa turned to look at Kisuke and invited him to step outside to talk. While Kisuke was desperate to find a cure for the emperor, the woman simply instructed her attendants to notify the royal family and the political officials to prepare for the worst. Her words carried an unspoken implication that she was already positioning herself to seize control of the royal court. And the reason the ministers had avoided his gaze earlier was simply because this woman, from the very start, had never once bothered to look for any actual cure. Kiska's expression darkened. If he could, he wanted nothing more than to tear off Europa's hideous mask right then and there. Fortunately, his guard managed to hold him back in time. This wasn't the moment to confront Europa, but Kiska's silence only made Europa even more brazen. She bluntly told him that if he was so intent on finding a cure, then he should go do it himself, and if by some chance the emperor woke up and named him crown prince, well, of course, compared to a noisy brat like you, our Khasidin is clearly far better suited to be crown prince. The mockery in her voice grew even more shameless. Nobody here truly believed the emperor would ever wake up. She'd already arranged a meeting with the empire's high priest, simply waiting for the moment the emperor's illness finally claimed his life. But just as Kiske was about to leave, a minister came rushing over in a fluster. Regarding the emperor's condition, his symptoms were remarkably identical to those of the young lady from House Oblong, and word had recently come that the Duke's family had found a cure. Even though it sounded absurd, even the faintest possibility was worth pursuing. So Kiska decided to head to House Oblong's residence himself to look for clues. Meanwhile, with Lady Ilya's curse now resolved, Sil finally allowed herself to relax completely, if only Kayok would just put down that violin of his for once. He'd been sticking to Sil like glue these past few days, to the point she'd nearly lost her mind. When asked, Kayok simply explained that he considered Sil a friend. He'd helped Michael apply for a young scholars grant, and even joined Ritus's sword practice every morning. Hearing this, Sil could only roll her eyes. Kids these days had no idea about anything. Just then, a carriage approaching the ducal residence caught Sil's attention. It was a carriage bearing House Kelt's crest. Its lead rider, brash and domineering, was busy shoving the crowd out of the way. Kayuk noticed the scene as well, but seemed entirely unbothered by it. The world knew House Kelt by the title The Hunting Hounds. Among the 5 great ducal houses, House Kelt had produced more royal guards than any other family, and aside from the royal family itself, no matter someone's rank or status, they were known for baring their teeth without hesitation. They'd even paid visits to House Laxia's mines before. Sil found herself losing all interest in listening any further. House Kelt turned out to be nothing special after all. Robin brought in the day's newspaper. In it, the Emperor's closest aides had remained tight-lipped about His Majesty's health. Sil turned to Kayak. Is His Majesty not doing well? But then, on second thought, Maximilian was already 99 years old. If it weren't for the fact that his heir had died young and left behind a grandson still too young to rule, a normal emperor at that age would have abdicated long ago. The thought that her old companion, who had once walked beside her, was now growing old like a fading rainbow, left Sil's heart heavy with conflicting emotions. She still wanted to see him one more time, even if only from a distance. She just wanted to know whether her old friend had lived a good life. Just then, a guard came to announce that a visitor had arrived at the ducal residence, asking specifically for Sil. Meanwhile, Kiske had already confirmed through Duke Oblong that the Emperor's symptoms matched Lady Ilya's exactly, and as luck would have it, the very girl who had cured her was still staying at the residence. Things were going even more smoothly than he'd expected. But the name Duke Oblong mentioned left Kiske deep in thought. Sil Laxia, the same name as the mage he'd met in the palace garden, though on second thought he figured it was probably just a coincidence. As for the girl who kept surfacing in his mind unprompted, Kiske quickly shut down that train of thought. Curing his grandfather was the priority right now. As the door to the room swung open, a voice from behind him left Kiske frozen in place for a moment. The instant their eyes met, both of them looked equally stunned. But Sil quickly composed herself, offering a slow, formal bow to the current imperial grandson. Duke Oblong arrived just then as well, and invited everyone to discuss the matter out in the courtyard. A moment later, Kiske simply gave a brief description of the Emperor's symptoms, and Sil immediately guessed it had to be a similar curse. She'd already been wondering what kind of madman would use House Oblong as some sort of test subject, never expecting the true target all along would turn out to be the reigning emperor himself. But before Kiske could even ask, Sil promised that no matter what it took, she would make sure the emperor woke up completely. Her words drifted over him like a gentle breeze, sweeping away the fear buried deep in the boy's heart. Looking at Sil's earnest expression, Kiske still felt compelled to warn her that if anything went wrong, the consequences could be severe. At this, Duke Oblong didn't hesitate for a moment, expressing his complete trust in Sil, even though there was much Kisuke still couldn't understand. Given the current situation, all he could do was choose to trust Sil as well. After Duke Oblong left, the two of them finally let their guard down a little. As for what they'd witnessed back in the palace garden, Kisuke decided to keep it a secret on Sil's behalf as well. Still, something about it struck Kisuke as odd. Sil's attitude toward him hadn't changed in the slightest, despite him being the Emperor's grandson. Even though revealing herself as a mage could put her in danger, Sil clearly believed that if it meant saving someone's life, she simply didn't care about the consequences at all. For a boy who had grown up caught in the palace's endless power struggles, it left Kisuke with a strange urge to reach out and touch the warmth of Sil's soul. Before long, the guards had the carriage ready, having witnessed Maximilian's curse with her own eyes. The progress seemed to be moving faster than Sil had expected, and after finally getting to see her aged disciple again, Sil's expression was filled with worry. If things kept going this way, he might wake up not even recognizing himself anymore. With that thought, Sil decided to immediately search for the medium of the curse. The two of them searched every waterway in the entire palace until they were nearly worked to exhaustion. Looking at the stream before her, Sil suddenly had an idea. Ignoring Kisuke's attempt to stop her, she immediately kicked off her shoes and waded into the water. The sight of her bare, delicate feet made Kisuke's face flush red instantly. Sil's magic spread out through the water and quickly picked up on the trace of the curse. But just then, Sil nearly lost her footing. Fortunately, Kisuke caught her in time. The sudden contact left Sil's face turning a little red as well. Fortunately, it was nothing more than magical exhaustion. Following the direction Sil's finger pointed, it turned out to lead straight to Second Consort Europa's palace. To think it would come to this. Facing the curse laid upon Maximilian, Sil once again refused to let it happen. She wouldn't let her former disciple fall before her eyes. Not long before, following the direction Sil's finger pointed, the cursed object turned out to be hidden within the Second Consort's own palace. To avoid drawing any unwanted attention, Kisuke didn't file for a formal investigation. He simply made up an excuse to pay a visit and slipped past the guards at the gate. The Second Consort's palace within the Empire couldn't be dug up carelessly the way Duke Oblong's residence had been. Sil could only rely on the most precise control of her magic to search, but the curse seemed to have vanished into thin air, and the excessive strain of releasing so much magic left Sil constantly on the verge of fainting. Kisuke could only carry her over to a bench to rest. He wanted her to stop pushing herself so hard, but Sil simply waved him off. Once her magic recovered, she said, she'd be fine again soon. The remark stirred up a long-buried memory in Kisuke. His own mother had once said the exact same thing, only to never wake up again. The boy felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of anxiety. Maximilian was, after all, his own grandfather. And yet Sil, a complete outsider, seemed even more desperate to save him than he was. To break the curse, she seemed willing to push right past the limits of her own body without a second thought. And that strange expression Sil had worn that day in the garden, when she mentioned her own grandfather, only made Kisuke more curious still, caught in the middle of it all. He felt like nothing more than a fool who understood nothing. At this, all Sil could do was try to comfort him. There were some things she simply couldn't tell Kisuke, but all she asked was that he trust her. No one wanted Maximilian's safety more than she did. Of course Kisuke trusted Sil, but thinking of what had happened to his mother, Sil's words, struck a nerve that left him deeply unsettled. After resting for a moment, Kisuke had planned to continue the investigation with Sil another day. But it was then that something occurred to Sil once more. She suddenly turned to look toward the garden and took off running. If the object had been buried inside the fountain, the connected waterways would make the curse spread all the more efficiently. With that thought, Sil scrambled desperately toward the top of the fountain. This was the most likely hiding place for the cursed object. But the very next moment, Sil's hand was suddenly repelled by some invisible force. No wonder she could sense the curse so clearly by the stream, yet couldn't detect it at all once inside the palace grounds. It turned out the search, lacking any physical medium, had been blocked by a barrier this whole time. The next moment, magic gathered in Sil's hand, and she slammed it hard against the barrier. The strike, carrying the full weight of Sil's magical power, shattered the barrier at once. And there the cursed object lay quietly at the bottom of the fountain pool. With the barrier broken, the cursed serpent within immediately sprang back to life and shot straight out of the palace grounds, hunting for its target, Maximilian. Sil had originally planned to burn the sacrificial object to destroy the curse, but being soaked in water, it simply refused to catch fire at all. A moment later, a massive serpent appeared in the Emperor's own bedchamber, throwing everyone present into complete panic. Kiske had to carry the exhausted Sil along as they rushed over. As the door swung open, the scene inside made both of their expressions change instantly. The massive serpent had already coiled itself around the Emperor, and the guards' attacks, lacking any magic behind them, proved completely useless against the black serpent. Sil took the long sword from one of the guards. Having already exhausted every last bit of her own magic, she could still draw on the residual magic left within the cursed object, fortunately. Even though that magic was far from pure, there was simply no other option left. Sil turned to face the black serpent. She would never allow Maximilian to lose his life right before her eyes, and the attack, drawing on dark magic, proved remarkably effective. The serpent's body began to disintegrate in patches all over. But unfortunately, the corrosive touch of dark magic gradually left Sil's arm completely numb. As the long sword slipped from her grip and fell to the ground, scenes from the past flickered before her eyes like a spinning lantern. It was then that a voice pulled Sil back from her daze. Kiske picked up the fallen sword for her and helped her grip it firmly once more. The dark magic that had once been pure black now shifted in tone, changed by Kiske's presence added to it. As the two of them brought the blade down together, the combined attack of their two intertwined magics spread instantly across the serpent's entire body. Inside the dream, Maximilian sat upon his throne, watching the endless stream of subjects come and go beneath him, his family and companions, one by one, having already left this world. Left this man, now nearly a century old, feeling a loneliness beyond anything words could describe. It was then that a black serpent came rushing toward him and coiled itself around his neck. An unbelievable voice echoed in his ears. It was his long-vanished brother, Fram, Sil's very first disciple. He said that their teacher, Sil, wasn't dead. "I will absolutely bring our teacher back, Maximilian." But faced with this madness-tinged voice, all Maximilian could do was watch it fade away. The sense of suffocation grew even stronger. He felt certain he would die at any moment. Then the very next instant, his eyes snapped wide open. He had no idea what had just happened. It was only the voice beside his ear that slowly made him turn his head. The delighted look and tone of Sil's voice instantly brought to mind his long-departed teacher. Maximilian's aged face filled with an expression of pure disbelief, but Sil, utterly exhausted by this point, collapsed right there in front of his bed. By the time Sil woke up again, she found herself in unfamiliar surroundings. It wasn't until Kiske's guard came to check on her that she learned she'd been running a fever and asleep for 2 whole days. Kayak and Kiske were both waiting at the door by then, assuring her they'd already explained everything to her 2 brothers on her behalf. A moment later, Kiske finally told her about his grandfather's condition. His body had returned completely to normal, leaving everyone convinced it was nothing short of a miracle. All of it thanks to Sil. Watching Sil's relaxed expression, Kiske still couldn't shake his confusion. She and his grandfather seemed to know each other as if they'd been close for years, and yet the young lady before him was clearly only 12 years old. Since Sil had only just woken up, Kiske suggested they wait until the next day to take her to see his grandfather. But then again, he still strongly disapproved of Sil pushing her body to such extremes. His nagging tone sounded exactly like his brother Leon's. Even though he wasn't him, this was simply how a brother showed he cared. At this, Kiske turned his head away with a stubborn pout. He hadn't been worried about Sil at all, he insisted. He'd meant to let the girl rest properly, but Sil stopped him before he could leave. In the moment, Kiske had helped guide her sword strike. Sil had noticed that he actually possessed innate magical talent, and immediately the thought of taking him on as a disciple crossed her mind. A wealthy disciple who did as he was told was a rather tempting thought indeed. The next day, Maximilian sat upon his throne. The scene from his dream still lingered in his mind. With their teacher gone for so many years, many of them had already given up hope of ever finding her again. Even though Maximilian still refused to believe his teacher was truly dead, he couldn't help but wonder if she really were alive. Why hadn't she ever shown herself to them? Just then, an attendant came to report that Lady Silaxia had arrived. He'd heard from Kiske that it was this very girl who had saved him. She really did resemble their teacher remarkably closely. And seeing Maximilian restored to full health, Sil too felt a deep sense of relief. She simply thought to herself that this old geezer still hadn't recognized her. The audience soon drew to a close, but before she could leave, the Emperor asked to have a private word with the young lady alone. Left alone with the Emperor, Sil had no idea what was going on for a moment. Maximilian then slowly began to speak. 80 years ago, a beautiful young lady who shared Sil's very name had once taken him on as her student, back when he was still a prince. Which was why, clinging to a faint hope, he wanted to ask the girl before him whether she might be his teacher. Returned after all these years to scold her hopeless student once more. Hearing Sil speak softly, Maximilian could no longer hold himself back, and pulled his teacher, whom he hadn't seen in 80 years, into a tight embrace. His memory of Sil remained as vivid as if it were only yesterday. Even though her appearance hadn't changed at all, the familiar smile at the corner of her mouth and the way her fingers lifted the edge of her skirt perfectly matched the image of Sil from 80 years ago in his memory. He truly, deeply missed his teacher. The boy who could never bear to give up even on a pet had grown old now, yet still waited for Sil to return. The boy Sil had once picked up out of a pile of garbage. Had lost all reason the moment his teacher passed away, and had spent the following decades quietly setting everything in place. Not long before, Sil had found herself wondering just how this crybaby had ever ended up inheriting the throne. According to Maximilian's own explanation, his eldest brother had been hopelessly love-struck, and his second brother had suffered a fatal accident while horseback riding, leaving him with no other choice but to take up the throne himself. Looking at this teary-eyed old man before her, Sil genuinely couldn't imagine how on earth he'd managed to raise a child like Kiska. And speaking of Kiska, Sil had only recently discovered that he too possessed a remarkable talent for magic. She'd even been considering taking him on as her disciple. Maximilian, to her surprise, wholeheartedly agreed, and even suggested that Sil take Kiske back with her to House Laxia's territory. Even though Kiske's life in the palace was one of luxury, it was anything but happy. A few years earlier, he had nearly been kidnapped, a maid's blade coming dangerously close to his throat. Ever since then, Kiske had remained wary of everyone around him. With both his parents gone, even if Maximilian handed him the throne itself, it would only bring him a lifetime of loneliness. Sil found herself agreeing with this completely. It seemed the only person Kiske truly had by his side was a guard named Nova, which was why she readily agreed to Maximilian's request. The two of them soon found themselves talking about news of Fram, as Sil's very first disciple. After she'd passed the mage tower down to him, it had somehow ended up collapsing. But when it came to Fram, Maximilian looked visibly troubled. Fram hadn't stayed in the position of master of the mage tower for very long at all. In Sil's eyes, Fram, whom she'd taken in and raised since childhood, had grown up carrying the same kind of stubborn determination she herself once had. On the battlefield where they'd sealed the demon god, he had also fought on the front lines against the dark cult. And tragically, Sil herself had ultimately perished on that very battlefield. From that moment on, Fram seemed to lose all sense of reason entirely. No longer having any heart left to care for the mage tower at all, the mage tower had been the best thing Sil could ever give Fram, a way for mages to find a proper place within the empire, and a way to ensure Fram, who had once wandered the streets alone as a child, would never be hurt again. Having failed to protect what his teacher left behind, Maximilian was consumed with guilt as well. But Sil didn't believe it was his fault at all. It was only when she thought of that lost disciple of hers that Sil felt a quiet ache of longing for him. But the past was the past, and it no longer mattered. Right now, Sil's only goal was to restore her family. And along the way, look after her disciple, just as she always had. But Maximilian reminded Sil that she'd forgotten something even more important, and that was to take care of herself. After Sil had left, a guard delivered a box as well. Maximilian sat and thought for a long while. His pet Bibi had already returned to perch on his shoulder by then. What was inside the box was something Bibi knew well too, an alchemical potion that had once extended its lifespan. It was also something Fram had entrusted to him many years ago. That had been the very last time Fram ever appeared before him. He'd wanted this potion used to extend Maximilian's own life. Even 30 years after his teacher had passed, he still firmly believed she would return one day. Even though he desperately wished he could welcome her back himself, he feared that by then he himself might no longer be around, which was why he'd entrusted the potion to the one person he trusted completely, Maximilian. When our teacher comes back, please tell her for me that I missed her very much. Maximilian opened the potion and drank the liquid down in one go. This had been the very last bottle. Maximilian found himself curious. How had Fram ever known their teacher would be reincarnated? But no matter what, he now had a reason to keep living. As for those who had already passed on, perhaps even they would never get an answer either. Sil had stayed at the palace for quite a few days. It was about time she returned to Duke Oblong's residence. Just then, Kiski came to see her off at the palace gates, watching as Sil prepared to leave. He still wished they could talk a little longer, but fortunately, with Raidus about to compete in the sword tournament, they wouldn't be heading back to House Laxia's territory until it was over, meaning they'd likely all remain in the capital for a while yet. Seeing Kiska looking rather bashful, Sil told him plainly that he was welcome to visit Duke Oblong's residence anytime he liked. They'd be seeing each other again soon enough anyway. His Majesty the Emperor had already agreed to let Sil teach Kiska magic. And with that, before the boy could even react, she had already climbed into the carriage heading back. It took Kiska a long moment, stunned, before it finally hit him. His own grandfather had basically sold him out. As Sil stopped hiding who she truly was, House Laxia too welcomed a new beginning. Meanwhile, Sil now sported 2 enormous dark circles under her eyes. The night before, seeing their sister finally back, Michael and Raidus had both flown into a mild fit of worry mixed with anger, assuming after she'd been gone so long that she must have run away from home again. It had taken quite a while to explain everything, and with her magic completely drained, she'd promptly collapsed face first onto the ground once more. The next day, Sil decided to spend the entire day holed up in her room. She hadn't revealed anything about the curse to anyone. She'd half expected knights to be sent out actively searching for the culprit. But there wasn't a single trace of a dark mage anywhere in the palace, which meant whoever was behind it was most likely someone within the second consort's own court, or perhaps someone capable of controlling the people there. Either way, Sil decided to simply report everything to Duke Oblong, since investigative work really wasn't her strong suit anyway. Around this time, the maid Robin also invited her young mistress to a party. What party? Sil had absolutely no idea what she was talking about. A moment later, Raidus loudly accused Sil of being completely unreasonable. How could she not even know her own brother had made it to the finals? Kayuk, never one to miss a chance to stir the pot, chimed in as well, pointing out that he himself had already prepared a gift, while Sil, of all people, his own sister, had shown up empty-handed. Hearing this, Sil immediately launched into an exaggerated performance, apologizing profusely while promising she would absolutely get her brother a gift. After thinking it over for a while, Raidus finally settled on what he wanted. He wanted to see his sister use magic. After all, in Raidus's mind, mages were always pictured as little old men. The idea was met with enthusiastic support from both Michael and Robin as well. Though thoroughly exasperated, Sil went ahead and snapped her fingers anyway. The next moment, palm-sized snowflakes of ice came drifting down from the sky. This was the gift she'd prepared for Raidus, a custom-made touch of atmosphere, made just for him. Worried that something like this appearing suddenly on the actual competition field might throw Raidus off balance, she figured this could serve as a little rehearsal beforehand. This truly was a moment worth celebrating, the rebirth of House Laxia. Meanwhile, Maximilian was in the midst of interrogating the second consort. The dark magic artifact had, after all, been discovered within her own palace. Even as Europa cried out that she'd been wronged, the Emperor paid her protests no mind whatsoever. If she couldn't prove her innocence, she'd better be ready to accept the consequences. Back when Kiski had nearly been kidnapped, Europa had worn that exact same look of feigned innocence. But now, having finally reached the limit of his patience, Maximilian made his final decision, sending Europa back to House Celt's territory, never to set foot in the palace again without the Emperor's explicit permission. Thinking of this, Maximilian found himself recalling the innocent young girl who had first entered the palace all those years ago, now grown into someone he could barely recognize. For a moment, he genuinely couldn't say whether it was time or the human heart that was truly the more terrifying force. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Raidus was on the training grounds, preparing for the final match. The sword tournament had already been underway for a full week. Even though Sil had missed several of her brother's earlier matches, she could still see just how much his swordsmanship had improved. Through all those years House Laxia had spent in decline, Raidus had made it this far entirely through his own effort. In the beginning, all he'd wanted was the prize money, so everyone could finally stop gnawing on rock-hard bread. But now, determined to free them all from that burden for good, Sil was resolved to restore House Laxia as quickly as possible. And to that end, she'd already worked out a plan. Starting a business and climbing to the very peak of life, But the ideas that had worked 80 years ago clearly wouldn't cut it now. Sil found herself thinking hard. What kind of innovation could only she bring to the table? It was around this time that Ritas noticed his sister looking distracted. He'd called out to her several times without getting any response. Training came to a pause. Kayuk came jogging over out of breath. He'd already lost 4 matches in a row to Ritas just now, thinking about how Ritas would be heading back to House Laxia's territory once the tournament ended. He found himself reluctant to lose such a great training partner, since the capital was so far from House Laxia's lands. The journey by carriage would take about 5 days. Sil, as a friend, you ought to help me out here. Isn't there some way to get there directly? Hearing this, Sil didn't hesitate for a second before blurting out, teleportation magic. And then, as if a switch had suddenly flipped in her mind, she wondered why she hadn't thought of it sooner. With that, she took off running without another word. Inside the palace, the very idea of teleportation magic drew enthusiastic support from everyone. It could prevent escapes when transporting prisoners. It would let maids far from home visit their hometowns if the teleportation magic of the Dewdrop Chamber could truly be restored. Just thinking about the business potential of it all left Sil buzzing with excitement. And right now, she was the only one who could make it happen. But more importantly than that, was the happiness this venture could bring to everyone. The young lady the world saw as nothing more than a fallen noble had quietly worked her way into the boy's heart without him even realizing it. Kisuke made his way to the library, searching through the shelves for books on magic. He couldn't help but find it strange that he'd never once imagined himself reading books like these. Ever since Sil had come into his life, that white-haired figure kept drifting into his thoughts at the most unexpected moments. Sometimes she felt so close, right within reach. Other times, impossibly far away, as if he'd never be able to reach her at all. It left Kisuke feeling unsettled more often than not. It was then that Nova, arriving to return a book, happened to notice the prince oddly hiding a book on magic, and immediately understood exactly what Kisuke was preparing himself for. Becoming Sil's student. Hearing this, Kisuke instantly bristled, as if caught completely off guard. Even so, Nova fully approved of Kisuke's decision. This was a stroke of good fortune meant for the prince. Nova's own childhood had been spent inside a prison cell. His father, in order to pay off a debt, had been forced to fight to the death in the arena, until the very day an iron sword, still stained with his father's blood, landed before him. Nova had known in that moment that his own life was about to end as well, which was why, before Kisuke had rescued him, Nova's entire world had consisted of nothing but fear and despair. So the fact that Kisuke now had the chance to see a much wider world was, without a doubt, a stroke of pure luck. Meanwhile, the royal family's formal letter of appointment arrived in Sil's hands as well. And since Kisuke was, after all, a member of the royal family, he would also be paying Sil a rather substantial tuition fee. Just as she was thinking about preparing a room for Kisuke, a slip of paper slipped out from between the pages of the letter. "Don't get the wrong idea, I'm not learning magic because of you." It was unmistakably Kisuke's handwriting. After confirming the letter of appointment, Robin hurried off to prepare a dress for Sil. With Ritas about to compete in the finals, Michael and Sil arrived dressed to the nines. The siblings' striking looks immediately set the nobles buzzing with talk. The very same House Laxia once dismissed as hopelessly fallen was now, of all things, considered a favorite to win the championship. And with that, all the old rumors that had once circulated dissolved into thin air. House Laxia, as it stood now, still carried the same brilliance it once had in its glory days. Seeing his siblings arrive from where he waited, Ritas looked genuinely delighted. Sil gave him a hug as encouragement. A moment later, the long-awaited final match of the sword tournament finally began. Simply making it to the finals was already an impressive feat in itself. But Ritas had no intention of stopping there. Years of relentless training, day after day, sent him charging straight at his opponent. The final skipped any tentative feeling out entirely, launching straight into a fierce, all-out clash from the very start. Even though his opponent in the final was unlike any he'd faced before, Ritas still claimed victory with relative ease, as his opponent lost the ability to fight back. The final came to its conclusion. The next moment, the stands erupted into thunderous cheers. A single ice crystal drifted down and landed before Ritas. He turned to look beside him. This had been prepared just for him by Sil. A special little celebration. There had been a time when all Ritas could think about was prize money. Back when, to save every last coin, he'd even decided to travel to the capital and compete entirely on his own. But now, standing here, he also had family he could rely on. And it was only in this moment that Radis felt a joy that truly came from the heart. That night, a grand banquet held in the emperor's name officially began, and for the first time in years, every single member of House Laxia was present at an occasion like this together. As the newly crowned champion, Radis was, without question, the star of the evening. Opponents he'd once defeated in the ring now greeted him warmly, already looking forward to facing him again someday. Even the representative of Duke Abeta offered his own words of recognition for Radis. Meanwhile, House Kelt made their entrance into the hall as well. Maz Ranket fixed his gaze coldly on Michael. After a brief, perfunctory greeting, he began openly criticizing the young Duke of Laxia standing before him. He bluntly pointed out that ever since the previous Duke had passed away, House Laxia had been absent from the royal council entirely. While the 5 great dukes enjoyed their privileged status, they also carried the responsibility of governing the empire, which meant missing council sessions was a serious accusation indeed. Michael found himself powerless to respond. He couldn't very well expose House Laxia's former guardian scandal to the public, and in the next breath, Maz proposed that House Laxia formally be stripped of its council seat. The moment a figure in white appeared before him. In the darkness of the boy's life, a beam of warm light broke through. Not long before, Maz's undisguised malice had thoroughly infuriated Sil. Surrendering their council seat would mean giving up the ducal family's power entirely. No family had ever before suffered such an insult. It was then that Duke Ibeta cut in with a smile, interrupting the exchange between the two. He remarked that while House Laxia had indeed grown somewhat lax in recent years, the matter of relinquishing a council seat should really be brought before the full council. This wasn't something that could be decided in an informal setting like this. Though his words seemed to be coming to the siblings' rescue, in truth, he'd effectively endorsed House Kelt's proposal. Hearing this, Sil spoke up, brushing past Michael's attempt to stop her. She pointed out that only the Emperor himself held the authority to remove a council member, a fact she hoped both gentlemen would kindly remember. It was then that Duke Oblong, arriving a little late, stepped forward as well, and scolded Maz for his disrespectful conduct. Anyone unaware of the situation might think House Kelt had run out of people. To let a representative of a ducal house say something so reckless. Without waiting for Maz to respond, Sil decided to put an end to this pointless farce. It would only take a year and a half. By next autumn's succession ceremony, House Laxia would lead the empire forward in an entirely new way. Hearing this, Maz nearly burst out laughing, dismissing it as nothing more than a child's empty talk. But with Duke Oblong having stepped in, he decided it was best to back off for the time being. Watching this, Radis and Michael could only think that their sister was remarkably bold indeed. Just then, Maximilian arrived at the hall as well. The moment the Emperor appeared, everyone instantly shifted into a display of flattery. Maximilian exchanged a few pleasantries first, then turned to look toward Sil, making his position clear to everyone present. The young lady of Laxia once personally taught me swordsmanship, and it seems the children of House Laxia today are every bit as worthy of that name. As a reward, the Emperor personally issued a decree, granting House Laxia the Bavaria estate, a gesture of care carrying far deeper meaning than it seemed. Left Sil marveling at just how much he had grown. Looking at her former student, now truly grown into an emperor capable of protecting others, Sil felt a genuine sense of comfort at the change in him. With that, the Emperor raised his glass, and the evening's banquet officially began. A moment later, Duke Oblong reminded Sil to keep a close eye on House Kelt's movements. But he also found himself curious about this new method Sil had spoken of, the one meant to lead the empire forward. But Sil had no intention of telling the old man. This was a secret that belonged to House Laxia alone. And with that, she slipped away. Out on the balcony, this was the most relaxed Sil had felt since her reincarnation. She was busy thinking about how to get that sly old fox Duke Oblong to lend a hand. Just then, a commotion from next door caught Sil's attention. It sounded as though second consort Europa was scolding Kiske. The atmosphere seemed remarkably tense. Sil crept closer to listen in. Europa spoke bluntly. She accused Kiske of trying to drive her out of the palace, even going so far as to enter her private courtyard without permission. And now the Emperor had ordered her sent back to House Kelt's territory, all because of Kiske, she said. At this, Kiske countered that hiding a cursed object in her own palace made Europa entirely responsible for what happened. But before he could even finish, a loud slap rang out, echoing through the quiet courtyard. I will make certain Cassidon sits on the throne, and you can forget about ever standing in his way." With that, Europa turned and stormed off. With things having come to this, Syl couldn't just stand by and do nothing. She made her way over to the balcony where Kiska stood, and conjured a butterfly out of magic, hoping it might lift his spirits a little. Pretending not to notice the boy's reddened, swollen cheek, she'd brought along some ice cream as well. Though she claimed she'd brought it for Kiska, he could tell at a glance that she'd really just wanted some for herself. With no other choice, Kiska draped his own coat over Syl's shoulders. And in that moment, he struck Syl as the very picture of what a crown prince ought to be. Hearing this, Kiski blinked in surprise. What on earth was Syl mumbling about now? But Syl made no attempt to hide it, willing to take risks just to protect the people she cared about. It was something Syl genuinely admired about him. Kiska found himself curious about the place the two of them would soon be heading to. What exactly was House Laxia's territory like? According to Syl, Laxia was filled with the scent of roses and cedar, and napping in the cool breeze there was one of life's simple pleasures. Looking at the girl beside him, Kiska's gaze slowly softened. Even though she was, admittedly, a rather strange mage, whenever he felt on the verge of breaking down, she always seemed to be right there beside him. The two leading men, locked in a jealous rivalry, turned the farewell ceremony into an all-out battlefield in an instant. The day before their departure, Kayuk sat with his feet propped up, remarking that Syl had some nerve. Clashing with Maz, who happened to be the second consort's own brother, Syl merely waved it off dismissively. Anyone who underestimated House Laxia wouldn't get off easy. With that, she casually tossed a gift over to him, a token of thanks for Kayuk's care these past few days. But it seemed Syl had forgotten something important. A gift like this carried a meaning all its own. Fortunately, it didn't lead to any serious misunderstanding. That evening, Syl had already drawn up her proposal for the magical portal project. Since magic stones were currently quite affordable, she hoped her brother Michael might introduce her to the merchant guild within their territory. This was also the very plan Syl had brought up during the banquet earlier. Hearing this, Michael agreed at once without hesitation. A moment later, Reedes, utterly baffled by his brother's decision, thought the whole idea of a magical portal sounded like pure fantasy, and worried that his sister's outlandish notion might end up embarrassing Michael, who already didn't get nearly enough respect as their older brother. But Michael's only response was to gently ruffle Reedus's hair. As the eldest brother, as long as his siblings were happy, he couldn't care less how many times he had to swallow his pride. He only hoped Reedus would join him in supporting their sister's decision. Meanwhile, elsewhere, upon hearing that Kayuk, who had never once shown any interest in leaving the capital, had suddenly announced he wanted to head to Ophanim, Duke Oblong could hardly believe his ears. At this, Kayuk explained that, as an ally of House Laxia, he wished to represent House Oblong and stay behind there. His condition, he said, was simple. He wanted his grandfather to let him take charge of House Laxia's related business ventures. Heading to Ophanim would mean not being able to return home for a long while. It would also mean meeting House Oblong's standards in the field of construction, a price Kayuk was more than willing to pay. Hearing this, Kayuk simply smiled. He'd already made up his mind. Afterward, he handed his grandfather the gift Syl had given him, a gemstone symbolizing House Laxia's friendship, with a note attached, saying she missed the fragrance of the tea served at the Oblong estate. This was yet another surprise Syl had left him with. It was the first time Kayuk had ever come to respect anyone outside House Oblong, and it wasn't just her mature way of thinking, but also a distinct charm all her own that made it impossible not to. The next day, Kiska, too, had finished preparing to head back to House Laxia's territory together with them. As a member of the Royal Guard, Nova immediately caught Reedus's attention. This reserve officer's interest made saying goodbye feel like it took forever. Kayuk, too, looked somewhat reluctant to part ways, but he trusted the two of them would see each other again soon enough. The carriage was soon ready to depart. Just as Syl turned around, she and someone else found themselves staring at each other in surprised unison, but Kiski quickly made clear that he was Syl's student now, and this was simply proper etiquette. Not to be outdone, Kayuk pointed out that Syl was a guest of House Oblong, and he was only being polite as well, not quite understanding what these two boys were even fussing about. Syl simply pulled the two of them apart. Once aboard the carriage, Kayuk finally revealed quietly the true meaning behind the gift she'd chosen for him. If given to someone who wasn't your partner, it carried the meaning, I want you for myself. The next moment, Syl understood exactly what kind of price came with teasing an innocent young man. Kayuk placed a light kiss on her hand, leaving Sill's fingers trembling ever so slightly, entirely out of her control. Even though that hadn't been her intention at all, the capital really was something else. Even the farewell had managed to leave Sill a little flustered. Still, this trip had brought her plenty of gains as well. Before long, Sill arrived at the Merchant Guild. With her plan about to get underway, it was finally time to part with the radiant rainbow necklace, resurfacing after 80 years. It left the craftsman practically drooling, offering an astronomical price for it. Even though it was the gift her brother Leon had once had custom-made just for her, and she couldn't help but feel a pang of hesitation over it, for the sake of restoring the family's former glory. Sill found she had no other choice. The genius young lady who had never once been in a relationship now, remarkably, found herself caught between the affections of two leading men, but at that very moment a scheme targeting House Laxia had already begun to unfold. Not long before, Carando, head of House Kelt, was consumed with fury. Europa hadn't even managed to hide a single cursed box properly. The woman herself was on the verge of a breakdown. If it weren't for wanting to see Cassidon ascend to the throne smoothly, she would never have agreed to work with her father in the first place, but now it was all over anyway. Seeing this, Maz tried to comfort his sister, telling her he'd still be in the palace to look after Cassidine. Meanwhile, Carando's only real concern was the plan he'd ordered carried out within House Laxia's territory. Even though they were both among the Empire's 5 great dukes, Carando was determined to reclaim that piece of land no matter what. Their father's authority left Maz with no choice but to go along with it. He only found himself wondering, since when exactly had his father taken up an interest in cats? Meanwhile, the residents in House Laxia's territory carried a warmth unlike anything found in the other ducal households. This one had been prepared specifically for Kiske, even though Maximilian had only managed to secure him a year's leave. Kiske was finally able to see for himself the territory Sill had once described as a place alive with birdsong and the fragrance of flowers. It was around this time, inside the study, that Michael and Sill both stared, stunned, toward the door. An old man had come rushing in and collapsed right there on the floor, begging them to increase the mining output. Seeing this, Michael quickly hurried over to help him up. "Lord Raynor, you're getting yourself far too worked up." He was the chief executive of the Brooklyn Trading Company. Even though Raynor knew full well the Empire kept strict control over mineral resources, his company had fallen into a genuine crisis, and he simply couldn't find any way out of it. Brooklyn was built on the very mines within House Laxia's territory. It had always maintained a steady, stable growth. The income wasn't especially high, but everyone there got along wonderfully. But recently, a large number of employees had begun leaving one after another. Without even bothering to give a reason, a new trading company called Via had lured them away with high wages. And that wasn't all. They'd even started undercutting the market price dramatically, stealing clients that had always belonged to Brooklyn. At this point, Sill could tell something was wrong. Whoever was behind this clearly wasn't interested in money at all. It looked more like they simply wanted to see Brooklyn destroyed entirely. And by now, Brooklyn was already on the verge of bankruptcy. Sill sensed keenly that this problem ran far deeper than it appeared. A territory's trading company was never just about commerce. They recruited local residents and traveled between different regions, gathering information while also playing a crucial role in the territory's entire economy. There was no way Sill would allow this trading company to collapse. Raynor suggested that the royal family could step in to help purchase the ore, making it much harder for Via to succeed. Both siblings agreed with this wholeheartedly. They decided that while reaching out to the royal family to increase their purchases, they would also head to the mines themselves to check on the situation firsthand. Not long after, Sill arrived in Brooklyn's commercial district. The moment she stepped off the carriage, a bleak, desolate atmosphere hit her immediately. The local population had dropped sharply, and there was no fixing that overnight. Sill had come here this time, with a purpose of her own as well. But given the scene before her, she decided it could wait a little longer. She then ran into the two of them, busy trying to coax a child, encouraging Sill to speak her mind boldly, though seeing this, Sill could only feel a bit exasperated. They were already run off their feet just trying to rebuild the trading company. And bringing up the whole portal project on top of that felt like way too much pressure to Sill right now. Just then, a girl came running over with a smile, greeting them warmly. Sill learned from Raynor that the girl was the daughter of the trading company's director. Raynor then introduced the siblings to Bianca. Seeing this, Bianca quickly offered a bow. She was in charge of making perfumes and other decorative goods for the company. It was around then that Raynor suddenly remembered today was the day of the trading company's regular meeting, and with that, he invited Michael to join him. Sil, on the other hand, had no interest in the meeting and offered to stay behind instead, to spend some time looking around with Bianca. A moment later, the two of them arrived at Bianca's workshop. Filled with all sorts of perfumes Bianca had crafted herself, Sil picked up one of the bottles sitting on the table and gave it a gentle press. A light, delicate fragrance drifted out. It was hard to believe something this refined had been made entirely by the girl standing in front of her. As for the trading company's current struggles, it clearly wasn't finding much favor in other territories. Bianca tried to reassure Sil, pointing out that House Laxia's situation was different from the other ducal houses, but quickly realized she'd said the wrong thing.
Sil, however, wholeheartedly agreed with her. Ever since returning,
She hadn't paid nearly enough attention to the rest of the affairs within her own territory. The thought left Sil feeling a little ashamed of herself. It was then that Bianca brought over a box. Her latest product, made from corn flour and herbs, said to leave the skin feeling soft and supple. Bianca's family ran a corn farm near the Campa region, an area with notoriously poor soil. Corn was really the only thing that could grow there, and even then, the quality never quite measured up to corn grown elsewhere. Rather than let the corn go to waste rotting in the fields, Bianca had decided to look into other uses for it. But if they tried to mass produce it, it would inevitably eat into their existing corn trade. Sil, however, found herself agreeing wholeheartedly with Bianca's idea. What this territory needed most right now was simply the courage to break from the status quo. Suddenly, an idea struck Sil. If the corn supply was plentiful, then Bianca's product could go into production without a hitch. If they used less corn flour, the effect would inevitably weaken. But Sil pointed out the real issue at hand. The powder was currently extremely fine, so even the lightest touch would coat the skin heavily, which meant no matter how careful someone was, most of it would still end up scattered and wasted during use. So all they really needed to do was compress the powder. That alone would reduce how much was needed each time. While still achieving the exact same effect, the suggestion completely resolved Bianca's dilemma. She promised that next time, Sil would see a product she'd be truly satisfied with. A moment later, the two of them brought their improved plan to report back to Bianca's father. Just then, they noticed an unfamiliar figure standing ahead of them. The moment the man laid eyes on Bianca, his gaze carried something distinctly unsettling. Rainer, unwilling to let him bother Bianca, demanded the man state his business at once. Michael, too, found himself curious about who this stranger was. It was only then that the man introduced himself, Raven, head of the Vija Trading Company. Starting tomorrow, he said he'd also be taking over as owner of the Dominic Winery. Right before Rainer's disbelieving eyes, he announced he'd bought out the four-generation family business from the Dominic family itself. And with that, he demanded that the trading company immediately pay off the winery's outstanding debt of 4 million gold. The blatant malice behind it made it seem as though he'd deliberately set out to saddle the company with this debt, and as if he already knew exactly how tight the company's finances were. He offered to accept a piece of land in exchange to settle the debt instead. He wanted the land in the Campa region, dismissing it as a worthless, barren stretch of dirt. With that, he told Michael to think it over carefully. If he was so intent on clinging to some noble, outdated sense of pride, perhaps it was finally time to let go of a burden he'd carried for 80 long years. But the Campa region was precisely where Sil's past self had been laid to rest. Michael refused outright to hand it over, no matter what. Even in the face of Raven's threats of bankruptcy, he wouldn't budge an inch. He'd lost all interest in continuing negotiations with the Vija Trading Company, and just before Raven left, he dropped one more bombshell. Bianca's father, Antonio, would be starting work at the Vija Trading Company next month. With that, he strode off without a second glance. On the carriage ride home, Michael, normally so cheerful, said nothing at all. Sil found her thoughts drifting back to something else entirely. The Campa region had once served as a stronghold for the dark cult, a place where countless horrifying rituals to revive the dead had once taken place. So why would the Vija Trading Company want that particular land of all places? Sil couldn't shake the feeling, though she wasn't sure if it was just her imagination, that the tattoo on the man's hand struck her as strangely familiar. This whole situation felt deeply unsettling, as if Sil had been pulled once again into some unknown, tangled scheme. He kept his fragile heart carefully hidden away, time and time again, setting aside his own dignity, all just to protect the family he loved so dearly. Upon hearing that Michael was even willing to write directly to the royal family, just to keep hold of the land in Campa, Sil found herself falling silent. Her past body had long since been swept up in a storm of magic and reduced to nothing but dust. And knowing how much effort Michael had poured into protecting it, Sil felt it simply wasn't worth all this trouble. But the moment she voiced that thought out loud, Michael, normally so mild-mannered, erupted with an anger she'd never seen from him before. He raised his voice, telling Sil to stop talking. If they gave up their great-grandmother's burial ground just because things got a little difficult, then what would come next? Their father's portrait, their mother's keepsakes, would all eventually be given away too, in one way or another. He held firmly to a line in his heart that he refused to cross. The first time he'd ever stepped through the doorway of the family shrine, Michael had understood this truth deep in his bones. Family was something that could never, under any circumstances, be cast aside, which was why he begged Sil never to say something like that again. At this, Sil found herself utterly unable to put into words everything she wanted to say. As time went on, her sense of guilt only grew heavier. A few days later, in the courtyard at House Laxia, ever since Kisuke had arrived to stay at the estate, things had grown remarkably lively, though not at all because of the household staff. News of the royal family's visit had sent reporters and admirers alike into an absolute frenzy, leaving even the estate's knights struggling to keep the crowds under control. Just then, a voice sounded from behind him. Kiska's expression looked rather dazed. He hadn't managed to catch even a glimpse of Sil these past few days. He'd been meditating so intensely he'd nearly fallen asleep in the middle of it. Sil, hearing this, reminded him just how important meditation truly was. It was, after all, an essential part of building up one's magical reserves. It was around then that Nova came rushing over as well, his cheeks looking a little irritated from the change in air. Come to think of it, the estate currently didn't even have a proper resident healer. But then an idea struck Sil. Bianca's new product might come in handy right about now, though it was still only in the development stage. The thought left Sil feeling the weight of the pressure all over again. It was around this time that Kiska noticed something in Sil's notes, and quickly asked her about it. Why exactly had she written down a symbol like this? It was only then that Sil learned from Kiska that this was, in fact, House Kelt's very own crest. That inexplicable sense of familiarity Sil had felt earlier had come from seeing that exact same pattern on Maz's own hand. The sight of the normally good-natured young lady's fury left even Kiska finding it hard to believe. It was around then that a letter from the trading company arrived in Sil's hands as well. After quickly reading through it, Sil told Kisuke to pass a message on to her brother, that she needed to head to the trading company right away. Meanwhile, Antonio, having just joined the Vija trading company, learned immediately that headquarters was about to relocate. Even though Antonio wanted an explanation, Raven, head of the Vija trading company, said bluntly that Antonio was nothing more than a lowly commoner, and if he wanted to keep any shred of dignity, all he could do was follow orders without question. Antonio tried to speak up in response, but Raven struck him down without a shred of mercy. He didn't believe for a second that someone like Antonio, once nothing more than a street peddler, had any right to argue with him at all. Think of the family you hold dear. With that final warning, Raven strode off without another word. A moment later, his wife fretted over Antonio's injuries. All he could feel was a deep sense of guilt toward his son and daughter. But just at that moment, Bianca came bursting excitedly through the door. "Look who I brought with me." The next instant, Sil strode confidently over the threshold, greeting everyone warmly. The silver hair unique to House Laxia let everyone instantly recognize exactly who she was, seeing her husband looking rather dazed. His wife hurried to bring Sil some tea. Sil had come here with one purpose only. She'd heard that Antonio had joined the Vija trading company, and she simply didn't buy the excuse that it was because of Brooklyn's poor finances. Perhaps others might misread Antonio's intentions, but surely no daughter could fail to understand her own father. Sil then cut straight to the point, asking whether the Vija trading company had threatened him in some way. It was only then that Antonio finally revealed the truth. He'd initially turned down the Vija trading company's offer of a high salary, but afterward, they'd started threatening his family instead. Having finally spoken the truth, Antonio looked visibly furious. He'd written to the ducal residence countless times, but back then, Michael, having lost the head of household ring, had been completely powerless to help. After reaching out for help so many times with no result, Antonio had given up hope entirely. He had no idea what Sil had come here for, but no matter what, he refused to gamble with his family's safety. Even though Sil had come prepared with a whole speech ready to give, the casual, understated words she'd meant to say simply couldn't capture the hardship this family had endured. Instead, Sil made a solemn promise on behalf of her family. House Laxia would absolutely save the Brooklyn Trading Company. And as for the means to turn the tide, it lay in exactly what Bianca had given her. Presenting herself as sweet and unassuming, she was finally about to reveal her true talent for magic, as the mastermind behind it all was about to be exposed. But strangely enough, the whole affair was about to take an even stranger turn. In a dimly lit room, Raven sat writing a secret letter. The plan to seize the Kampa region was proceeding smoothly. A year ago, he'd been nothing more than a wandering mercenary. But thanks to Maz's promise, as long as he managed to pull this off, it would transform him once a nobody, a complete washout, into a nobleman overnight. Once the Brooklyn Trading Company collapsed, the downfall of the ducal house would follow as an inevitable consequence. With that thought, Raven leaned back with his legs propped up, already anticipating his reward. A few days later, as Sil sat leisurely enjoying a cup of coffee, Raynor came rushing in. The total value of the company's orders had somehow surpassed an entire year's worth of sales, all thanks to the tireless work Bianca had been putting in. It was right around then that the largest pharmaceutical merchant in Mont came forward offering an exclusive distribution partnership. The news came as such an overwhelming shock that it left Raynor collapsing straight to the floor in disbelief. As it turned out, just a few days earlier, Bianca's improved product had officially gone on sale, and having conveniently been given to Nova to try out beforehand, it had already received glowing feedback. Most warriors' armor tended to be rather rough and uncomfortable, but Bianca's product managed to ease that discomfort considerably. Hearing this, Sil immediately began thinking of ways to promote it further. Not long after, an interview about Kisuke's stay in House Laxia's territory officially began. A refreshing breeze carrying the faint scent of roses left Kisuke thoroughly pleased, but before long he found himself growing visibly stiff as he started reciting the lines Sil had prepared for him about how wonderful the products developed by the ducal estate were, and so on. With this endorsement from the royal family behind it, Bianca's products spread like wildfire to every corner of the empire almost overnight. Before long, Bianca found herself sporting 2 enormous dark circles under her eyes, having worked overtime for days on end, leaving the girl looking utterly worn out. Worried that a spy from the Vija Trading Company might have infiltrated her own company, she had insisted on making every single product entirely by herself. Seeing this, Sil grew genuinely worried. If this kept up, Bianca was bound to collapse from exhaustion eventually. Sil had always believed that a merchant's true pride lay in creating real value, and Bianca had more than proven herself to everyone by now. All that was left now was for her to properly rest. Not long after, Antonio slammed 4 million gold coins down on the table, clearing Brooklyn's entire debt in one go, leaving Raven utterly stunned. Upon hearing that Antonio still intended to stay with Brooklyn, the veins on Raven's forehead bulged with fury. He renewed his threats against Antonio's family once more, but Antonio remained completely unmoved. That night, watching Bianca and her brother walking along a narrow path, Raven emerged from the shadows of the night, determined to make Antonio pay for his decision. The next moment, he drew his long sword and brought it down hard toward Bianca. But the scene he'd imagined never came to pass. Instead, his own body suddenly felt strangely light, followed immediately by a sharp, searing pain. As he was slammed hard onto the ground, he stared ahead in disbelief. Bianca had effortlessly taken down the remaining assassins herself, and with that, her silver hair came into view. It was only then that Ritus revealed his true identity. All this had been part of an elaborate plan he'd carefully arranged for his sister. Realizing he'd walked straight into a trap, Raven immediately turned to flee. But just as he was about to get up, he found Sil standing right in front of him. A cruel smile spread across his face, and he lunged quickly for the sword lying nearby. But the very next moment, a fierce blaze of fire erupted right beside him. The young lady who had always presented herself as sweet and gentle finally revealed her true identity as a mage. A moment later, Raven found himself locked away in House Laxia's dungeon. Just the day before, he'd been dreaming of a life of nobility. But now, looking at the young lady before him, all he felt was utter confusion. While Raven remained baffled, Sil found herself equally curious about him. Sil's fingers spread slightly apart, and Raven's hands were lifted into the air, bound by magic. As the pattern matched the very same one etched in Sil's memory, it confirmed exactly who was truly behind everything, and she sent people to search Raven's office at once. Hearing this, Raven's expression changed instantly. The letters still sitting in his desk drawer, never sent. rendered every excuse he might have offered utterly meaningless. As for House Kelt's orders, they had simply told him to seize the land in Kampa by any means necessary. With that, Raven slumped weakly to the ground, blood trickling unconsciously from the corner of his mouth. Startled by this sudden change, Sil rushed into the cell. She still had so much more she needed to ask him. She couldn't let Raven die so easily, not yet. But the very next moment, Sil suddenly sensed the unmistakable presence of a curse lingering around him. He thought of Sil as family. All because after his teacher had passed away, Fram had descended into madness and vanished completely. But the truth behind the curse had now surfaced, tied unmistakably to Fram's very name, as the curse began spreading through Raven's body. But the very next moment, he stared in horror at the long sword before him. Raven, standing right there, had suddenly lost every last memory he had. The moment he spoke the secret aloud, the curse would activate. Sil quickly turned and instructed the guards to take the letters recovered from Raven's office. She still couldn't understand why House Kelt was so fixated on this barren stretch of land known as Kampa. Not long after, with Raven gone, the Vija Trading Company collapsed entirely, and the Brooklyn Trading Company was restored to full vitality once more. Around this time, the royal decree increasing or purchases finally reached Michael's hands. Because of this document, Sil had seen her brother staying up late into the night on more than one occasion. Even in such a difficult situation, Michael always managed to handle things with a calm, steady composure. As Brooklyn gradually returned to life, Sil, too, found herself swamped with work these days, so she hired Bianca's brother on as an assistant. The project that had been put on hold because of the Brooklyn crisis had finally reached the point where it could begin. According to Sil's plan, the portal business should first launch between House Oblong's and House Laxia's territories. To that end, she hoped Raynor could provide both manpower and funding for mining the magic stones needed. The idea left Raynor momentarily unable to quite believe what he was hearing. But looking at the young lady before him, the confidence shining in her eyes was enough to make him believe without even realizing it. What had once seemed like an utterly absurd idea now genuinely felt like something Sil could actually pull off. He had no idea what kind of future Sil might bring to the Empire, or how he ought to feel about facing it. But in the end, he chose to place his trust in whatever decision this young lady before him had made. Meanwhile, with Maz's plan having failed, Carando, head of House Kelt, completely lost his composure. Even though Carando had always been reclusive by nature, he would never have descended into such madness the way he had now. It was around this time that a cat entered the maid's field of vision. She couldn't help but feel the black cat seemed unusually intelligent. It had even appeared in her dreams and spoken its own name, a black cat named Fram. Meanwhile, after a long, exhausting day, Teacher Sil had planned to rest, feeling as though she'd packed an entire lifetime's worth of work into these past few weeks. But remembering that Kiski's magic lessons still weren't finished left Sil practically wanting to cry. She figured he'd surely built up more than enough magical power by now. All that was left was for his teacher to step in. The next day, Teacher Sil officially began her lessons. As stack after stack of books were laid out across the table, it gave the young royal grandson quite a shock. This was apparently just one day's worth of reading. Kiska felt like he had nothing left to live for. Looking at Sil, so earnest and focused before him, she didn't look the slightest bit like someone actually younger than him. Sil began by explaining the fundamentals of magic, the 5 elements and the reactions each of them produced. As Sil filled an entire blackboard with dense notes, she turned around only to find that Kiska had already slipped away. And over the days that followed, Kiska never failed to come up with some new excuse to skip class. The next moment, Sil finally reached her breaking point. Ritas's expression turned solemn. This has really gone too far. That clicking sound had been echoing in Sil's ears all afternoon. The two of them had actually been playing billiards right in front of her, and loudly at that. Seeing this, Sil could only sigh in resignation. Kiski clearly had real talent for magic. He'd managed in just 1 month what would normally take others a full year to master. Because her past students had always approached their lessons with such enthusiasm, Sil had naturally expected the same from Kiske. That evening, Kiska's strange behavior left Sil feeling rather anxious. She made her way to Kiska's quarters and carefully cracked the door open to peek inside. The setting sun streamed in through the window, casting its light softly across Kiska's face. Sil could hardly believe her eyes. Kiska had actually been secretly studying magic on his own, but the boy told her not to get her hopes up. He still had no intention of attending her lessons. Sil only wanted to sit and talk with him for a while. All she'd ever really wanted from the very start was a student, or perhaps a friend, to share magic with. Sil had simply assumed that Kisuke would naturally take an interest in it. Without ever stopping to consider how the boy truly felt, hearing this, Kisuke slowly began to open up. This was exactly what he found himself resenting. No one had ever once asked for his own opinion or cared how he actually felt about anything. Simply because of who he was, every hardship placed on him was treated as something he should just accept. There was a time he'd once practiced archery until his fingers bled, and all he'd gotten in return was contempt. Every bit of pain he ever let show only ever turned into more mockery, cutting straight into his heart. But the very next moment, Sil simply pulled him into an embrace. It was only then that she truly understood the fear buried deep within the boy. The dark mark of the departed somehow bore the very same signature Sil herself had once personally taught. As the whole truth finally came to light, Fram, who had once been so fiercely, almost obsessively protective of Sil, had remarkably ended up standing directly against her. Not long before, the moment Kisuke had let his guard down, revealed the fragile vulnerability hidden beneath a boy's exterior, leaving Sil with a quiet ache of sympathy for him. No matter what, Sil promised, as his friend, she would always stand by his side. With this newfound warmth and support behind him, Kisuke's magic training went remarkably smoothly from then on, though every now and then he still managed to leave Sil utterly speechless. Like just a couple of days earlier, with the fire spell, which had very nearly set Sil's own hair on fire. Just as everything seemed to be settling back into a peaceful rhythm, Robin came rushing in, clearly in a panic. House Laxia's family cemetery had somehow been cursed. A moment later, Sil and Radis stood together at the graveyard. Radis had only meant to pay respects to their mother, never expecting to find a scene like this. The once carefully maintained cemetery was now, overnight, completely overrun with thorny brambles covering every inch of ground. Sil reached out her hand, trying to sense any trace of magic, but couldn't detect even the faintest hint of it anywhere. Kisuke practiced magic in the garden every single day, precisely because it was rich with the natural magic the environment provided. But this vast stretch of land before them now didn't carry even a trace of magic within it at all. The next moment, a fearsome gust of wind whipped up around Sil's hand. Flames gathered in her right hand, and instantly set every last thorny bramble ablaze. This was the very first time either of them had witnessed Sil wield magic on such a massive scale. Sil raised her left hand toward the sky. Rolling storm clouds gathered, bringing rain pouring down, extinguishing the raging fire in an instant. The thorns burned away completely. This was the very place where their uncle and brother Leon now rested eternally, the resting cradle for generations of their ancestors before them. Sil would never allow anyone to defile this sacred ground. It was then that the magic circle, only briefly glanced over the last time, suddenly struck Sil as oddly familiar in its inscribed markings. Sil's expression froze. This was unmistakably a life sacrifice spell, used to bring back the souls of the departed. The grass, drained of all its magic, had withered, and the ground itself had cracked apart. It suddenly occurred to Sil that the barren state of the Kampa region had to be connected to this very same thing. A familiar memory surged into Sil's mind, triggered by the inscribed markings. This had to be the very same script she'd once carefully taught to Fram herself. But why would something like this be used to carve dark magic? Where on earth was Fram right now? She knelt down, running her hand over the carved markings again and again. She found it hard to believe everything that was happening to her. Her bond with Fram had begun with nothing more than a chance encounter. A boy who looked, at first glance, like nothing more than a beggar, and yet refused to accept charity from anyone. He'd declared plainly that he carried the pride of an alchemist. The vitality in his eyes, unwavering and undimmed, had deeply moved Sil. On a similarly rainy day, as Sil prepared to leave, Fram had simply hidden his face beneath his hood. Getting to spend even a short while with his sister figure had already been more than enough to satisfy the boy. He'd told her he only hoped everything would go smoothly for her from here on, and that she wouldn't get dragged down into the misery of people like him. But Sil had simply held out an umbrella toward him instead, telling him she intended to take him along with her. From then on, Fram became Sil's very first disciple, revealing an extraordinary talent for alchemy. He stuck close to Sil's side every single day. Even the smallest, most offhand compliment from her was enough to make Fram happy for an entire day. Their two fates had, without either of them realizing it, become deeply intertwined. Upon learning that Sil was about to face off against the demon god, Fram had already begun looking forward to a peaceful life alongside his teacher, once all the dark mages had been wiped out entirely, and for that goal, he would stop at nothing against his teacher's enemies. He only hoped Syl's own hands would never have to be stained by such ugliness. When it came to anything connected to the dark cult, he showed mercy to no one, not even the youngest of children. Fram's own parents had, after all, died at the hands of the dark cult. At the time, Syl had simply assumed it was a matter of seeking revenge, never realizing the depth of the obsession and madness festering within Fram's heart. One was the complete annihilation of the dark cult. The second was Syl herself. The very next day, Fram defied Syl's orders for the very first time. He drew the blood of a dark mage and let it flow into the altar the cult had prepared. It was this act that finally allowed the demon god to break free of its chains. And in Fram's disbelieving eyes, it was ultimately Syl who stood between the Empire and total destruction. And Fram, who had once hated dark mages more than anyone, had, 80 years later, become a dark mage himself. Seeing his sister looking troubled, Rades quickly spoke up to comfort her. The Syl of the past had always been the most timid among them. She'd even written Rades letters every single night before bed. "Brother, that cat is crying again." It sounded just like a baby wailing. The sound would echo behind Syl every single night back then. And once the sound finally faded, it would be followed by faint whispers, vaguely murmuring, "The time is almost here." The ordeal the original Syl had gone through was now being told to her through Rydas's own words. Everything that had happened to her felt like a nightmare shrouded in impenetrable fog, leaving Syl desperate more than anything to finally learn the truth. Meanwhile, Vito was in the middle of reporting the trading company's plans to Syl, but Syl seemed to take a long moment to snap back to reality. Noticing this, she quickly apologized, admitting she simply hadn't been sleeping well these past few days. Robin, watching her young mistress, was filled with worry as well. Ever since returning from the burial site, Syl had seemed utterly lost in thought, barely touching her food. Watching Robin's anxious figure retreat, Syl turned instead to ask Vito about the situation in Kampa, only to learn that several members of House Kelt had been sneaking into the Forbidden Zone once used to summon the demon god. Vito, for his part, seemed entirely unsurprised by this. Given how obsessively Duke Corando pursued his goals, House Kelt had long since earned itself quite the notorious reputation. With that, Syl instructed Vito to look further into the matter, gathering more information on House Kelt, as well as on a dark mage known as Fram. House Kelt, it seemed, had ties to dark magic running far deeper than anyone realized. That same familiar face surfaced once more in Syl's mind. Just then, Vito instructed his attendants to bring in the gifts they'd prepared. Sack after sack was set down on the ground, every single one of them filled entirely with magic stones, all of it mined under Raynor's supervision, sent specifically for Syl to use in her research and teaching. Seeing this, Syl's first instinct was to go tell Kiski the news right away. But the moment she stood up too quickly, a sudden wave of dizziness overtook her. Syl found herself dreaming. Her brother Leon appeared in the dream, suggesting to Syl that she dismiss Fram from her service, even though, in the dream, Syl still saw Fram as nothing more than a 16-year-old boy. Leon had already noticed the obsessive streak building within him. His devotion to Syl, who had taken him in, bordered on an almost fanatical intensity, and Leon refused to let someone like that stay so close to his sister. Even though Leon genuinely wished that Syl, who always insisted on carrying every burden alone, could have someone she could truly lean on for support. But the dream suddenly turned dark. Leon's figure slowly began to fade away. No matter how desperately Syl struggled, she simply couldn't break free from the encroaching darkness. Her brother's warm words still lingered in her ears, but everything happening to her now left Syl overcome with fear. Syl's eyes snapped open, tears still clinging to the corners of her eyes. Kiska's worried voice reached her. It seemed Syl had had a nightmare, which had left Kiska thoroughly worried about her. Syl always seemed to collapse out of nowhere, and thinking back on everything she'd been through, left Kiska feeling a flicker of frustration. Why did Syl always insist on pushing herself so hard, foolishly, without a second thought? He knew he probably wasn't mature enough himself yet, but no matter what, he hoped that whenever Syl needed help, she would come to him first, right away. Kiska handed Syl a warm towel to wipe her face. It was only then that Syl finally opened up about her plan. She was researching a way to use magic for large-scale transportation. This project carried all of Syl's determination behind it. She hoped that through it, she could help House Laxia reclaim the glory it had once known 80 years ago. That same unwavering determination struck Kiska as strangely familiar. Like most people, Kiska too had once held a similar dream of his own. To become a truly great emperor, he too had once been willing to give everything for that goal. But when the harsh blow of reality struck, it had left him losing all confidence in himself. A dream, he realized, was something that left you both frightened and thrilled all at once. Yet Sil never stopped moving forward toward hers. Even while carrying the weight of her own burdens, she never once let it slow her steps. Meanwhile, inside House Celt's residence, Fram held Duke Carando suspended in midair. The thing he was looking for still hadn't been found after all this time, as his body dropped back to the ground. Carando immediately threw himself prostrate before the man once more, his body trembling uncontrollably. Fram had officially returned. Though his control over his own body still had its limits, he decided to give Carando one final chance, one last chance to avoid being torn apart by the Black Cat. Not long after, Sil and Kiska found themselves sprawled on the floor together. Ever since Sil's collapse, Kiska had taken on the role of her research assistant. With the magic circle now fully inscribed, Kiski immediately moved an item into position within it. The next moment, Nova came flying straight out of the magic circle and landed face first on the ground. The experimental attempt at spatial teleportation left Nova utterly thrilled beyond belief. He reported back to Sil on the details of the experiment. Every activation of the spell consumed part of the magic stones involved, and when teleporting a living creature, the consumption was far greater than with an ordinary object. At this rate, the magic stones would be completely used up before long. Hearing this, Kiska turned to Sil, curious. How many magic stones could you get from selling off an entire mine? A few days earlier, he'd received an invitation from the royal family, announcing a hunting tournament to be held that autumn, with the championship prize being none other than a mine located in Timo territory, and Rydas too would be participating, which meant winning the championship wouldn't be easy at all. But Kiske still wanted to win that mine, so he could personally present it to Sil as a gift. Having made up his mind to hand the mine over to Sil with his own two hands, in order to keep his promise, the two of them spent their days moving between spatial magic and flame spells. Half a year passed by in what felt like no time at all. Baron Yennis, the man in charge of the hunting tournament, was responsible for receiving the Laxia party upon their arrival in Timo territory as the Emperor's own grandson Kiske, and Rydas, champion of the sword tournament, quickly drew everyone's attention. Noble young ladies eagerly offered up their handkerchiefs as tokens of support for the two of them, but neither of them accepted a single one, simply because both were holding out, hoping instead for a token of support from Sil. Rydas muttered under his breath to Bibi about his sister, certain she'd already prepared a handkerchief for him. Not to be outdone, Kiske insisted his teacher's handkerchief was obviously meant for him instead, the two of them behaving like a pair of children, left Sil utterly exasperated. Fortunately, she'd thought ahead and prepared too, avoiding what could have been an awkward situation entirely. A moment later, Kiska, having arrived at the hunting grounds, prepared to show Sil around the surrounding scenery. But the instant they returned to their lodgings, a figure bearing a striking resemblance to Kiska suddenly appeared before them. The moment the boy spotted Kiska, he greeted him warmly and enthusiastically, complaining that Kiska hadn't written him a single letter in the 6 months since he'd left, which had left the boy feeling rather hurt. The color of his hair, unmistakably marking him as royalty, instantly let Sil recognize exactly who he was. Kassadin, Kiska's half-brother? It was around then that Kiske introduced Sil properly, but Sil found herself completely distracted throughout. Even her response to Kassadin's greeting came off rather awkward. Even though Kassadin behaved with the utmost warmth and friendliness, the tension between him and Kiske ran deep, the two of them practically fire and water. Having gone through her own guardianship conflict, Sil understood all too well that even royalty couldn't escape such things. Meanwhile, Kiska's entire body had gone visibly tense. Even that brief exchange with Kassadin had already left him feeling noticeably drained. Kiska asked Sil if they could put off their plan to see the scenery for a little while, giving him yet another reason he simply couldn't afford to lose. Before long, Sil and Rydas went out to explore the nearby town. A girl named Eusis stopped them along the way. It turned out that ever since the sword tournament, she had developed an undeniable fondness for Rydas. Flustered, she pressed a handkerchief into his hands, then shyly asked if he might take a walk with her. Rydas tried to use his sister Sil as an excuse, claiming they still had something to attend to. But when he turned around, Sil was already nowhere to be found. Not wanting to get in the way of her brother's budding romance, Sil had already slipped away without a trace. But she hadn't gotten very far before she heard someone calling out to her. It turned out to be Vito, who had already gathered the information Sil needed. Having rushed all the way to Timo territory, specifically so as not to delay her plans. While Sil couldn't help but admire his impressive work ethic, Vito also introduced an unfamiliar man standing beside him, someone who had helped him gather information, and had come along specifically to ask Sil for a favor of his own. A moment later, Vito finally shared the information he'd gathered. According to the captured thief's own account, House Kelt had been searching Kampa for a particular sword, though as for what the sword actually looked like, the thief could only offer a rough description. But the moment Sil heard this, something clicked in her mind instantly. She fought to keep her racing emotions under control, and turned to ask Vito whether the holy sword was still enshrined within the temple. But the answer she received was that the holy sword had vanished without a trace ever since the great battle 80 years ago. The holy sword Aster was the one and only vessel capable of sealing the demon god. Since ancient times, the wicked deity who ruled over death had tried, time and again, to sweep across the world, endlessly tempting those who longed to possess dangerous power. And whenever the crimson light of the altar used to revive the demon god was lit, it marked the moment the holy sword would choose its next wielder to go to war. But Sil, in her past life, had already sealed the demon god, which meant, by all rights, the temple should have taken the sword back into its keeping. And yet the sword had remained in Kampa this whole time, leaving Sil utterly unable to guess the temple's true intentions. What puzzled her even more was why House Kelt had grown so fixated on the holy sword in the first place. That same familiar figure kept resurfacing again and again in Sil's mind. But one thing was certain. All of this was somehow connected to Fram. It was then that Vito introduced the man standing beside him, a man named Iota, who had proven to be a great help while Vito was gathering information. Sil could tell exactly what he was after, using this assistance as a way to get closer to her. Iota, for his part, neither confirmed nor denied it. He simply reached up and pulled back his hood. The instant Sil got a clear look at his face, she immediately recognized him as a member of House Elisa. House Elisa was a bloodline born of both humans and elves, gifted with extraordinary magical talent, and yet their mixed heritage meant they could never gain true acceptance in either world. Iota had come to find Sil, simply because House Laxia